Imagine waking up one morning and suddenly your world is different. Sirens wail, planes thunder over the cities, borders are crossed, and an entire state becomes the first victim of a war that will soon engulf the entire world. This is exactly what happened on September 1st, 1939, when German troops attacked Poland, triggering the Second World War. But was the Polish campaign really just a quick military victory for Germany? Or was it the beginning of something much bigger, darker, and more brutal? Behind this attack were not only tanks, planes, and soldiers, but also propaganda, collusion, political deception, and the will to reorganize Europe by force. In this video, we look at how the invasion of Poland came about, why Poland fell into a deadly trap between Germany and the Soviet Union, and why Britain and France declared war on the German Reich after this attack. We talk about Hitler's goals, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the attack on Westerplatte, the Soviet invasion, and the cruel consequences for the Polish population. Before we begin, write me in the comments. Do you think that World War II would have started exactly the same way without the Hitler-Stalin Pact? Or would the attack on Poland have been much riskier without this collusion? If you are interested in historical topics and want to understand how political decisions, striving for power and military force have changed the world, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any more videos about the big turning points in history. For the Polish campaign was not only the beginning of a war, it was the moment when Europe finally entered the abyss. Chapter 1: The Shadow of Versailles. When the weapons of the First World War fell silent on November 11, 1918, Europe was not really pacified. The fronts fell silent, but under the surface fear, anger, hunger, political uncertainty, and deep national grievances remained. Millions of people had fallen, entire regions had been destroyed, old empires had collapsed, and new states had emerged from the ruins of an order that had grown over centuries. Germany had lost the war, Austria-Hungary had disintegrated, the Russian Empire was shaken by revolution and civil war, and Poland was returning to the map of Europe as a separate state after more than a century of partitions. What was a historic moment of rebirth for the Poles was later perceived by many Germans as a painful loss. It was precisely in this contrasting perception that one of the most dangerous conflict substances of the interwar period lay. Poland had been divided by Prussia, Russia, and Austria in the late 18th century, and had long ceased to exist as an independent state. But the Polish nation had never disappeared. Language, culture, Catholic traditions, memories of former greatness, and the desire for self-determination survived in families, churches, schools, associations, and political movements. When the First World War weakened the old partitioning powers, a historic window opened for Poland. In November 1918, Polish independence was restored. But this new state was confronted with enormous problems from the beginning. Its borders were disputed, its population was ethnically and religiously diverse, its economy had to be pieced together from territories that had previously belonged to different empires, and its security was far from guaranteed. Poland lay between Germany and Russia, two powers that had both experienced defeats, revolutions, and territorial losses, and in whose political culture the new Polish border was not accepted by many. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 was intended by the victorious powers to create a new peace order. In Germany, however, it quickly became a symbol of national humiliation. The Reich lost territory, had to disarm, pay reparations, and acknowledge responsibility for the war. Many Germans were particularly affected by the cession of West Prussian and Poznan territories to Poland. This gave Poland access to the Baltic Sea, while East Prussia was separated from the rest of Germany. This so-called Polish corridor became one of the strongest symbols of the alleged injustice of Versailles in the German public. It was not just about maps. It was about identity, honor, economic interests, and the question of who should determine East Central Europe after the war. The city of Gdansk played a special role in this conflict. It was mostly German-speaking, but was not simply left part of Germany. Instead, the Free City of Danzig was created under the protection of the League of Nations, while Poland received certain economic and foreign policy rights. Gdansk was important for Poland because the young state needed reliable access to the sea. Without a port, trade and connection to the world economy, his independence would have been strategically weakened. For many Germans, however, the regulation appeared to be an artificial separation of a German city from the Reich. In the sober language of diplomacy, it was about customs rights, port facilities, railway lines, and international guarantees. In political propaganda, this became an emotional question of national dignity. The Weimar Republic, which emerged in Germany after the war, was burdened from the very beginning. It had to administer a lost war, overcome a severe economic crisis, curb political violence, and at the same time live with a peace treaty that large parts of the population rejected. Right-wing parties, nationalists, former officers, and later the National Socialists used the Treaty of Versailles as a permanent target for attack. They claimed that Germany had not been defeated militarily, but had been betrayed by internal enemies. This so-called stab-in-the-back legend was historically false, but politically effective. It turned the defeat into a myth that directed guilt inwards and hatred outwards. In this way of thinking, Poland was often not seen as a legitimate neighbor, but as a product of German weakness and victorious politics. After 1918, Poland did not simply see itself as the winner of a new order. The young state had to maintain its existence militarily. In particular, the war against Soviet Russia in the years 1919 to 1921 shaped Polish security thinking. In the Battle of Warsaw in 1920, Poland succeeded in stopping the advance of the Red Army. This victory was celebrated in Poland as the salvation of its own independence. At the same time, it reinforced the awareness that Poland stood alone between hostile powers. In the East, the Soviet Union was threatening. In the West, Germany remained dissatisfied, and the Western Allies were far away. France supported Poland politically and militarily, but Paris was not on the Vistula. Great Britain, on the other hand, often viewed Eastern Europe with greater distance. Poland therefore knew that treaties were important, but did not automatically mean security in an emergency. The new European order was therefore contradictory from the beginning. She spoke of self-determination, but many borders gave rise to new minorities. Germans lived in Poland, Poles lived outside Poland, Ukrainians, Jews, Belarusians, Lithuanians, and other groups found themselves in states whose majority nations developed their own ideas of national unity. In Poland, this led to tensions because the state, although it was Polish, included large minorities. In Germany, the German minorities in Poland were politically instrumentalized. Every complaint, every conflict, every border question could be exploited by nationalist forces. Simple enemy images were made out of real problems. With the world economic crisis from 1929 onwards, the situation worsened dramatically. Unemployment, social hardship, and political radicalization destroyed the trust of many people in democratic solutions. In Germany, Adolf Hitler masterfully used this crisis for his propaganda. He promised work, order, national rebirth, and the revision of Versailles. For him, the treaty was not just a diplomatic document, but an enemy that could be used to mobilize the masses. But Hitler's goals went far beyond the withdrawal of individual treaty provisions. While conservative nationalists may have wanted lost territories back, Hitler thought in terms of race war, living space, and imperial expansion to the east. It was no coincidence that Poland was at the center of this. It was on the way to the space that the National Socialists wanted to conquer, settle, and forcibly reorganize. After Hitler's seizure of power in 1933, Germany initially appeared more cautious to the outside world than later developments would suggest. In 1934, the German Reich even concluded a non-aggression pact with Poland. For Poland, this was an attempt to gain time and balance the dangerous situation between Germany and the Soviet Union. For Hitler, it was a tactical step. He wanted to isolate France, temporarily reassure Poland, and give Germany the opportunity to rearm. While the world still hoped the treaties could secure peace, the Nazi regime was already beginning to lay the military foundations for future wars. Conscription was reintroduced, the Air Force was built up, armament was accelerated, and society was ideologically prepared for battle. In the years that followed, it became increasingly clear that the Order of Versailles was not stable. Germany invaded the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936, annexed Austria in 1938, and subsequently smashed Czechoslovakia. Every successful border violation increased Hitler's self-confidence and weakened the credibility of Western democracies. The Treaty of Versailles, which was supposed to limit Germany, gradually lost its practical effect. At the same time, Hitler learned that risk could be rewarded as long as Britain and France shied away from war. Poland watched this development with growing concern. The breakup of Czechoslovakia was a warning signal, because it showed that German demands did not end with individual concessions. The shadow of Versailles therefore lay not only over Germany, but over the whole of Europe. It consisted of open border issues, wounded national pride, economic insecurity, mutual distrust, and the weakness of international institutions. The League of Nations could hardly enforce conflicts if great powers were determined to circumvent it. The democracies were tired of war, the dictatorships became more aggressive, and many people did not want to admit that a new major war was possible. But while some politicians still believed in compromise, Hitler was already preparing the next escalation. Poland thus became the focal point of a European crisis much older than September 1939. The later attack did not begin with the first shots on Westerplatte. It had its prehistory in the peace treaties after 1918, in the German rejection of the post-war order, in Polish security fears, in the weakness of Western guarantees, and in National Socialist ideology. Versailles had not necessarily caused World War II, but the unresolved conflicts of the post-war period provided Hitler with the ground on which to base his propaganda, his demands, and ultimately his war. When the crisis over Gdansk and the corridor escalated in 1939, it was never just about one city or one transport link. The question was whether Europe was prepared to set limits to the politics of violence. And it is precisely Poland that should decide this question. Chapter 2: Poland between two powers. Poland, after its rebirth in 1918, was a state full of hope, but also a state in an almost impossible situation. On the map of Europe, his return seemed like the restoration of historical justice, because for more than a century foreign powers had divided Polish territory among themselves. For many Poles, independence therefore meant not only political self-determination, but the fulfillment of a national dream that had been preserved for generations. But this dream was under enormous pressure from the beginning. Poland was located exactly where the interests of Germany and Russia had touched, overlapped, and fought each other for centuries. It was a state between two powers, both larger, more populous, and more dangerous in the long run. In the West was Germany, which never really accepted its defeat of 1918 and the loss of territory. In the East, revolutionary Russia gave rise to the Soviet Union, which pursued its own goals and saw Poland as an obstacle between itself and Central Europe. This geographical location determined almost every political decision of the Second Polish Republic. Poland could not derive its security solely from its army, its diplomacy, or its national self-confidence. It constantly had to weigh up how to behave towards Berlin and Moscow, without becoming dependent on one side and without unnecessarily provoking the other. This balance was extraordinarily difficult. Although Germany and the Soviet Union were ideologically enemies, both had reasons to reject the Polish post-war order. For German nationalists, Poland was a symbol of Versailles, a state that had supposedly been created at the expense of Germany. For Soviet strategists, Poland was a hostile buffer state, blocking the way to the West and playing a painful role in the memories of the lost war of 1920. Poland could therefore hope for no real friendship either in the West or in the East. The Polish leadership knew that independence could not be taken for granted. Marshal Józef Pilsudski, one of the formative figures of the new state, thought in grand geopolitical contexts. He distrusted both Germany and Russia and looked for ways to secure Poland through his own strength and regional alliances. His idea was that Poland should not become the plaything of foreign great powers. At the same time, he was aware that Poland alone would hardly be able to repel a simultaneous attack from the West and East. This realization became a fundamental problem of Polish foreign policy. They had to act as if they could remain independent, even though the military and economic conditions for doing so were limited. After the Polish-Soviet War from 1919 to 1921, the threat from the east was particularly alive. The Red Army had tried to advance westwards, and Poland had stopped this advance in the Battle of Warsaw. In Poland, this victory was remembered as a miracle on the Vistula, as a moment when the young republic saved its existence. But the Peace of Riga did not eliminate the enmity. The Soviet Union accepted the border because it was temporarily forced to do so, not because it considered Poland a permanent partner. In Moscow, the idea persisted that Poland was a hostile state that hindered Soviet interests. In addition, there was the ideological dimension. The communist regime saw the world in categories of class struggle and revolution. An independent Poland with an anti-communist government did not fit into this idea. In the West, the situation was no less problematic. Although the Weimar Republic was democratically constituted, many democratic and moderate German politicians also rejected the eastern border. The desire for a revision of the Treaty of Versailles was not only a National Socialist demand. It was widespread in large parts of German society. In particular, the Polish corridor, Gdansk, and the situation of German minorities in Poland were repeatedly portrayed as open wounds. This created a permanent tension that could not be resolved simply by diplomatic politeness. Even in phases when Berlin and Warsaw were negotiating with each other, mutual mistrust remained. Poland therefore sought support from the West. France became the most important ally. The Franco-Polish alliance was intended to deter Germany and secure military aid for Poland in an emergency. From the Polish point of view, this was logical, because France was the strongest continental power among the victors after the First World War and also had an interest in limiting Germany. But this alliance had weaknesses. France was far away, and between France and Poland lay Germany. If Germany attacked Poland, France would have to become active in the West to tie down the Wehrmacht. Whether Paris would be willing and able to do so at the decisive moment remained uncertain. Poland could not be sure whether French guarantees would actually lead to rapid military relief. Great Britain also played an important role, but London has long viewed Eastern Europe with greater distance. For British politics, the focus was primarily on the European balance. Many British politicians wanted to avoid a new major war and considered some German complaints about Versailles to be at least partially negotiable. This attitude later contributed to the policy of giving in to Hitler. This was dangerous for Poland, because it meant that its interests were not always a top priority in the eyes of Western powers. Warsaw could hope that Britain and France would act in an emergency, but it could never be fully relied upon. Poland's internal situation made the situation even more complicated. The state was young, its institutions had to be built, and its society was diverse. In addition to the Polish majority population, millions of Ukrainians, Jews, Belarusians, Germans, and Lithuanians lived in the country. This diversity had grown historically, but brought political tensions with it. The government in Warsaw wanted to form a strong nation-state, but the minorities had their own interests, languages, and identities. Especially in the eastern regions, the bond with the Polish state was not equally strong everywhere. For foreign powers, such tensions offered opportunities for influence and propaganda. Germany could point to German minorities, the Soviet Union to social and national conflicts in eastern Poland. This made Poland vulnerable, not because it was internally weak in the simple sense, but because its diversity could easily be used against the state in an aggressive international environment. Militarily, Poland relied heavily on its army and on the will to defend itself. The Polish army was not insignificant, on the contrary. It had brave soldiers, experienced officers, and a strong sense of national duty. But it faced structural problems. Poland had a long border with Germany. In addition, East Prussia threatened the north, and in the east was the Soviet Union. The shape of the Polish territory made it difficult to defend. Important industrial areas were close to possible fronts, transport routes were limited, and the modernization of the armed forces could not keep pace with German rearmament. While Germany invested massively in tanks, air force, motorization, and modern communications in the 1930s, Poland lacked the economic opportunities to arm at a comparable pace. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to portray Poland as a passive victim without any political options for action. The Polish leadership tried to actively shape its situation. In 1932, Poland concluded a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, followed by a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1934. This policy was intended to prevent Poland from being drawn into a conflict too early. They wanted to gain time, stabilize their own position, and avoid being completely tied to a great power. But this balancing policy was based on the assumption that Berlin and Moscow would respect their agreements, at least temporarily. With Hitler in power, this assumption became increasingly dangerous. After 1933, the situation changed step by step. Although Hitler spoke at times of understanding with Poland, his long-term goals remained aggressive. National Socialist ideology did not regard Eastern Europe as an area of equal states, but as an area of future German expansion. Poland was not respected as a permanent neighbor in this notion. It was an obstacle. The Polish government recognized the danger, but its options were limited. An alliance with the Soviet Union seemed to many in Warsaw to be just as dangerous as subordination to Germany. The memory of the War of 1920, the fear of communism, and the concern for one's own sovereignty made close cooperation with Moscow hardly politically acceptable. At the same time, giving in to Hitler would have been a risk, because every concession could have resulted in new demands. The breakup of Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939 showed Poland how dangerous the situation had become. Hitler had initially argued with the right of self-determination of the Sudeten Germans, but then occupied the rest of the Czech state. This made it clear that he was not only concerned with German minorities. It was about power, control, and expansion. For Poland, this was a clear warning. If Germany now demanded Danzig and traffic rights through the corridor, Warsaw could not be sure that peace would be bought. On the contrary, giving in would have strategically weakened Poland and made it politically dependent. The leadership in Warsaw feared that Poland would be pushed step by step into the role of a German satellite state. When Great Britain and France gave Poland guarantees in the spring of 1939, the situation seemed to improve at first. Now Hitler could no longer assume that an attack on Poland would have no major international consequences. But this guarantee was also a sign of how serious the crisis already was. Poland received political backing, but no immediate military security. If Germany were to attack, Poland would have to survive the first few weeks largely on its own. The Western powers could not immediately stop the German advance on the Vistula. This was precisely the tragedy of the Polish situation. Diplomatically, Poland was no longer isolated, but militarily it remained exposed at the decisive moment. Poland between two powers was therefore more than a geographical description. It was the fate of a state whose independence was questioned from two sides. Germany wanted to destroy the Order of Versailles and expand eastwards. The Soviet Union was waiting for an opportunity to regain lost influence and shift its borders to the west. Poland tried to survive through alliances, treaties, and its own defense readiness. But when Berlin and Moscow came closer in 1939, the basis of this policy collapsed. The nightmare that Polish strategists had feared for years became reality. Germany and the Soviet Union were able to come to an understanding against Poland. Thus, the difficult situation between two powers became a deadly trap. Chapter 3: Hitler's Goals in the East. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, it initially seemed unclear to many observers how far his foreign policy goals would really reach. Some conservative politicians, diplomats, and foreign governments believed that Hitler's main aim was to revoke the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, to strengthen Germany militarily, and to restore the Reich's lost position in Europe. But this interpretation fell far short of the mark. Hitler was no ordinary nationalist revisionist politician who only wanted to change individual borders or make Germany a recognized great power again. His goals were more radical, brutal, and long-term. At the center of his worldview was the idea of a racially motivated war of conquest in the East. In this ideology, Poland was not simply a neighboring state with which one argued about Gdansk, railway connections, or trade issues. Poland was an obstacle on the way to a much larger project, the violent reorganization of Eastern Europe under German rule. Hitler's thinking was already shaped by the idea of the so-called Lebensraum long before he came to power. In his mind, the German people needed additional space, food, raw materials, and settlement areas in order to survive as a world power in the long term. This space was not to be sought overseas, as the German Empire had tried to do with colonies before 1914, but on the European continent, especially in the East. By this, Hitler meant above all areas inhabited by Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, Jews, and other population groups. The people who lived there were not recognized as equal peoples in National Socialist ideology, but were regarded as supposedly inferior. This way of thinking made the coming war particularly dangerous, because it transformed political opponents into people who could be denied any right to self-determination, property, dignity, and life. For Hitler, foreign policy was therefore never inseparable from ideology. His military plans, diplomatic steps, and propaganda demands served a worldview that was supported by racism, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and the will to power. Eastern Europe seemed to him to be a space that was to be conquered, exploited, and colonized. The German population was to rule there one day, while large parts of the native population were to be expelled, enslaved, or deliberately held down in their social development. These ideas were not only later war fantasies, but belonged to the core of National Socialist policy from the very beginning. The attack on Poland was therefore not just a military campaign. It was a first step towards a policy that amounted to occupation, terror, expulsion, and annihilation. Hitler initially used a different language to the outside world. In the 1930s, German propaganda repeatedly spoke of national equality, of the correction of alleged injustices, and of the protection of German minorities. These terms sounded understandable to some people abroad at first, because in fact many borders were disputed after 1919 and national minorities lived in different states. But Hitler did not use such topics to seek a fair balance. He used them as a lever to build up pressure, destabilize states, and gain power step by step. This had already been shown in Austria and Czechoslovakia. First there was an argument of self-determination, then threats, diplomatic blackmail, and finally military occupation. It is precisely this pattern that should also play a role vis-a-vis Poland. Poland occupied a double position in Hitler's thinking. On the one hand, it was a state whose existence many German nationalists had rejected since Versailles. The Polish corridor, Danzig, and the German minorities offered propaganda easily understandable points of attack. On the other hand, Poland was geographically located exactly between Germany and the areas further east, which Hitler wanted to conquer in the long term. As long as Poland remained independent, it blocked the direct route to the east. Hitler therefore had to decide whether Poland should be integrated into a German order as a dependent partner or crushed as an opponent. In the first years of his rule, he at times toyed with the possibility of neutralizing Poland diplomatically or using it against the Soviet Union. The German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact of 1934 fitted into this tactic. It was intended to reassure Poland, weaken France, and buy Germany time for its own rearmament. But this treaty never meant that Hitler permanently respected Polish independence. The National Socialist leadership thought in stages. First of all, Germany had to consolidate its domestic policy and become militarily capable of acting again. Then the restrictions of Versailles were to be removed. After that, the empire was able to expand gradually. The reintroduction of compulsory military service, the establishment of the Air Force, the occupation of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, and the destruction of Czechoslovakia were stations on this path. Each success reduced the inhibition before the next step. Hitler got the impression that his opponents were insecure, slow, and tired of war. In particular, the reactions of Great Britain and France to the crisis over Czechoslovakia strengthened his sense that he could achieve more through determination and risk than through cautious diplomacy. Czechoslovakia was an important warning for Poland. In 1938, Hitler had initially focused on the Sudeten Germans. He claimed that it was about the rights of a German minority. After the Munich Agreement, Germany received the Sudetenland. But that didn't satisfy his hunger. In March 1939, the Wehrmacht occupied the rest of Bohemia and Moravia. This finally shattered the claim that Hitler only wanted to bring Germans home to the Reich. Now it was obvious that his policy was aimed at domination over foreign peoples. For Poland, this meant that every German demand had to be viewed with the greatest suspicion. When Hitler demanded Danzig and demanded an extraterritorial connection through the corridor, no one could be sure that these would be the last demands. Hitler's goals towards Poland became increasingly aggressive in 1939. Danzig was to return to the Reich, and Germany demanded transport connections to East Prussia. To the outside world, this was presented as a limited and reasonable correction. But in reality, there was more at stake. A Polish concession would have damaged the country's sovereignty and pushed it into political dependence on Germany. Hitler did not want to respect Poland as an equal state, but to include it in his strategic plans. When Warsaw was not ready to bow to this pressure, Poland finally became the target of an attack from a possible tactical partner. A crucial point was Hitler's contempt for the ability of Western democracies to act decisively. He believed that Britain and France would not risk a major war because of Poland. This assessment was based on the experience of previous years. Again and again, the West had protested, negotiated, warned, and in the end gave in. However, Hitler underestimated that the breach of the Munich promises and the occupation of Prague had destroyed confidence in his promises. Great Britain and France now gave Poland guarantees because it became clear to them that further concessions would not slow down Germany's claim to power, but only increase it. Nevertheless, Hitler remained convinced that he could control the crisis. The German military planning against Poland showed that it was not just a matter of diplomatic pressure. The Wehrmacht was preparing a rapid, concentrated attack that would militarily crush Poland before the Western powers could intervene effectively. Poland's geographical location was to be exploited. German troops could attack from several directions: from the west, from East Prussia in the north, and from the area of the now controlled former Czechoslovakia in the south. Poland was to be surrounded, its armies separated from each other, and its political leadership incapacitated. Speed, air superiority, and operational mobility were the focus. The military strategy was in line with the political intention. Poland was not only to be defeated, but also to be removed from the European power game as an independent factor. Even more frightening was the fact that the war against Poland was associated with violence against the civilian population from the beginning. The National Socialist leadership did not regard the coming campaign as a normal war between states, in which a peace treaty would be concluded after a victory. Even before the attack, lists of people considered dangerous were prepared: intellectuals, priests, teachers, officials, officers, political activists, and other members of the Polish elite. The aim was to destroy Poland's social leadership and weaken any resistance. Anti-Semitism also played a central role. The Jewish population of Poland was large and diverse, and it immediately became the focus of Nazi persecution after the occupation. Thus, the Polish campaign was already a transition from military conquest to ideologically motivated occupation violence. Hitler's view to the East was therefore more than a foreign policy direction. It was an expression of a worldview in which law, treaties, and human dignity had meaning only as long as they served one's own power. Poland stood in the way of this worldview because it was independent, because it blocked access to further areas of conquest, and because its existence was reminiscent of the Order of 1919 that Hitler wanted to destroy. The conflict over Gdansk and the corridor was therefore only the visible surface. Underneath this was a much deeper will to expand. Anyone who wants to understand the Polish campaign must recognize precisely this difference. It was not just about borders. The question was whether a sovereign state could stand in the way of a totalitarian regime's claim to power. In the end, this mixture of ideology, strategic calculation, and personal will to power led directly to war. Hitler believed that determination, violence, and deception were stronger than alliances, treaties, and international order. He wanted to isolate Poland, defeat it quickly, and then present the Western powers with a fait accompli. But the attack on Poland was not just another step in German expansion. He became the trigger of the Second World War. This showed that Hitler's goals in the East were not regionally limited. They blew up the European order as a whole and opened the way to a war that would soon encompass almost the entire world. Chapter 4: Gdansk and the Corridor. If you want to understand the path to the Polish campaign, you have to look at two terms that appeared again and again in the 1930s: Gdansk and the Polish Corridor. At first glance, they seemed like individual disputes on a complicated map. A city on the Baltic Sea, Poland's narrow access to the sea, a railway connection to East Prussia, customs rights, ports, and border lines. But in reality, these issues intensified almost all the tensions that Europe was unable to resolve after the First World War. Here, German requests for revision met Polish security interests, historical memories met economic necessities, national feelings met strategic calculations. For Hitler, Danzig and the Corridor eventually became political tools. They served him as a pretext to put pressure on Poland and to present the attack as an allegedly necessary correction of an unjust order. Gdansk was an old trading city with great symbolic significance. For centuries, it had occupied a special position in the Baltic Sea region. At the end of the First World War, the majority of its population was German-speaking, but the city was also closely linked to Polish history and economy. After the Treaty of Versailles, Danzig did not become part of the German Empire and was not fully incorporated into Poland. Instead, the Free City of Danzig was created under the protection of the League of Nations. Poland received important rights, especially in the areas of foreign policy, customs, transport, and port use. This solution was intended to create a balance. It was intended to secure Poland's access to the sea without placing the German majority of the city's population directly under Polish rule. But as is so often the case in the post-war European order, the compromise was clearer on paper than in reality. For Poland, access to the Baltic Sea was a question of survival as a modern state. A country the size of Poland could not be completely dependent economically and strategically on foreign ports and transit routes. Without a connection to the sea, Poland's sovereignty would have been restricted, because trade, raw materials, military supplies, and international contacts could have been influenced by neighboring states at any time. Therefore, from the Polish point of view, the so-called Polish Corridor was not a provocation, but a necessity. It connected the Polish heartland with the Baltic Sea and gave the state its own opening to the world. This view has often been suppressed or deliberately distorted in Germany. There was talk of a fragmentation of the empire because East Prussia was now separated from the rest of Germany. This separation was indeed a logistical and emotional problem for many Germans, but it was also part of an order that was to enable Poland to exist independently in the first place. It was precisely these contrasting perceptions that made Gdansk and the Corridor so dangerous. For German nationalists, they were proof that Versailles had humiliated and mutilated Germany. For Poland, they were the basis of its own independence. What one side felt was wrong, the other regarded as the minimum condition of its security. It was difficult to achieve a lasting balance between these positions, especially because political language was increasingly dominated by emotions. In Germany, the corridor was not soberly viewed as the result of complicated ethnic, economic, and strategic considerations. He became a symbol of national insult. Maps, newspaper articles, speeches, and textbooks could create the impression that Germany had been arbitrarily violated in the East. The fact that Poland also had historical claims, security needs, and economic interests hardly played a role in this account. In Danzig itself, the situation worsened considerably after Hitler's seizure of power. The National Socialists gained ever greater influence in the city. Danzig increasingly became a political focal point, where German nationalists agitated against Polish rights and against the international order of the League of Nations. The Free City was not formally part of the German Reich, but pressure from Berlin grew. National Socialist organizations, propaganda, and intimidation increasingly shaped public life. This became dangerous for Poland, because Gdansk was not just a symbolic issue. Polish postal services, customs officials, port rights and transport routes were concrete elements of Polish presence. When these rights were eroded, Poland gradually lost influence in a place that was crucial to its security. At the same time, Poland expanded the port of Gdynia in response to the uncertain situation. Gdynia developed into a modern Polish port in the 1920s and 1930s and became a visible sign of national self-assertion. For Poland, Gdynia was a success because it reduced dependence on Gdansk. For German nationalists, however, this expansion was further proof that Poland wanted to establish itself permanently on the Baltic Sea. Thus, even economic modernization became politically charged. In the atmosphere of the interwar period, every harbor crane, every new railway connection, and every state investment could be read as a sign of a larger power struggle. Hitler recognized the propagandistic value of these questions very well. He knew that Gdansk and the corridor triggered strong feelings in Germany. Demands for the return of Danzig to the Reich and for a connection to East Prussia could easily be presented as limited, seemingly reasonable concerns. To the outside world, Berlin could claim that it was only about correcting obvious injustices. But the actual intention was more dangerous. Hitler used these demands to put pressure on Poland and test its sovereignty. If Warsaw gave in, Poland would have been politically weakened. If Warsaw refused, Hitler could portray Poland as intransigent and hostile. In both cases, German propaganda gained material for its narrative. The demand for an extraterritorial connection through the corridor was particularly sensitive. At first glance, it might seem like a technical traffic problem. Germany wanted a road and railway connection between the Reich and East Prussia, without Polish control. But for Poland, such a solution would have meant that a piece of German sovereignty would have run right through Polish territory. This would have damaged the territorial integrity of the country and would have set a dangerous precedent. Warsaw had to fear that such a concession would only be the beginning of further demands. The experience with Czechoslovakia was still fresh in mind. There too, Hitler had initially raised limited demands before destroying the entire state. Poland could therefore not assume that a compromise around Danzig would secure peace. For the Polish leadership, the situation was almost hopeless. A hard no increased the risk of a German attack. However, giving in could lead Poland to a creeping dependency. Gdansk was not just a city, and the corridor was not just a land connection. Both issues affect the dignity, security, and freedom of action of the state. If Poland gave up central rights out of fear of Germany, it would have dramatically weakened its position in Europe. In addition, the signal to Hitler would have been clear: pressure works. He had already had exactly this experience several times. In the case of the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, his opponents had hesitated or given in. Poland did not want to become the next victim of a policy that saw every compromise as an invitation to new demands. Hitler's actions followed a familiar pattern. At first, grievances were asserted or exaggerated. Then the German minority was portrayed as threatened. Subsequently, demands were made that were supposedly only intended to establish peace and justice. If the other side did not agree, it was described as aggressive, unreasonable, or controlled by foreign powers. In this way, the National Socialist regime was able to reverse the roles. The attacker appeared as a victim in his own propaganda, and the threatened country became an alleged troublemaker. This technology was not only intended for the German public. It was also intended to confuse foreign countries, sow doubt, and weaken the willingness of Britain and France to support Poland. The international situation made this strategy even more dangerous. Many people in Western Europe did not want a new war after the horrors of the First World War. Some were prepared to regard German demands as partly understandable, especially if they were justified by the right to self-determination. Hitler played with exactly this mood. He presented his policy as a limited revision, when in fact it was part of a larger expansion program. This made Gdansk a kind of test case. If the Western powers were to give in again, Germany could isolate Poland. If they remained firm, Hitler could claim that Germany was threatened by enemy encirclement. In Poland, it was increasingly recognized that it was not just about negotiations, but about power. Foreign Minister Josef Beck tried to represent the Polish position confidently. Poland is ready to talk about practical issues, but not ready to give up its independence. This attitude was risky, but necessary from the Polish point of view. It had taken the state more than 100 years to become independent again. To endanger this independence by seemingly small concessions to an aggressive regime seemed unacceptable to many in charge. Behind the Polish attitude was not recklessness, but the bitter insight that peace at any price could ultimately be more expensive than resistance. By the summer of 1939, Gdansk and the corridor had finally turned into explosive material. The German press intensified its attacks, incidents were exploited, and Berlin increased diplomatic pressure. At the same time, military preparations had been underway for a long time. This shows how dishonest the German argumentation was. While rights, corridors, and alleged injustices were still being talked about to the outside world, the Wehrmacht was already preparing the attack. The political demands were not the actual goal, but part of the staging. They were supposed to prepare, justify, and morally conceal the coming war. In the end, Gdansk and the corridor became symbols of a destroyed European order. They showed how unresolved border issues, national emotions, and aggressive ideology could create a crisis that could hardly be controlled. But it was not decisive that there were controversial issues. There are always disputes between states. The decisive factor was that Hitler did not want to solve them, but to use them. He did not seek a stable balance with Poland. He was looking for a way to weaken Poland, isolate it, and finally attack it. Danzig and the corridor were therefore not the cause of the war in the simple sense. They were the stage on which a long-reaching claim to power became visible. Behind the language of homecoming, traffic rights, and national justice stood the will to conquer. This is precisely why the path from Gdansk did not lead to compromise, but to war. Chapter 5: The Hitler-Stalin Pact. The Hitler-Stalin Pact is one of the decisive turning points on the way to the Second World War. It was a treaty that appeared to the outside world like a sober diplomatic agreement, but in reality sealed the fate of entire states. When the German Reich and the Soviet Union concluded a non-aggression pact on August 23, 1939, it had the effect of a political earthquake on many contemporaries. Two systems that had presented themselves as bitter enemies for years suddenly came to an agreement. On the one hand, there was National Socialist Germany, marked by anti-communism, racism, and the goal of violent expansion to the east. On the other side was the Stalinist Soviet Union, which presented itself ideologically as an opponent of fascism and at the same time pursued its own power politics in Eastern Europe. The fact that these two dictatorships negotiated with each other showed how little ideology excluded diplomatic expediency at the decisive moment. Both sides despised each other, but both realized that they could benefit from each other in the short term. For Hitler, the pact was above all a strategic liberation. He planned the attack on Poland and wanted to prevent Germany from immediately getting into a war on two fronts. The memory of the First World War played a major role in this. At that time, Germany had to fight France and Great Britain in the west and Russia in the east at the same time. Hitler initially wanted to avoid this mistake. If the Soviet Union remained neutral or even indirectly participated, the Wehrmacht could attack Poland without having to fear a Soviet counterattack in the rear. Moreover, Hitler could hope that Britain and France, despite their guarantees to Poland, would hesitate when it was clear that Poland was also threatened from the east and no longer had a realistic possibility of holding out for long. The pact was intended to make the war against Poland more calculable. For Stalin, on the other hand, the agreement offered a different, but equally tempting opportunity. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union was internationally isolated, distrusted Western democracies, and at the same time feared Germany's growing power. Stalin had seen how Great Britain and France had acted in the crisis over Czechoslovakia. From the Soviet point of view, the Western powers had not stopped Hitler, but had made important gains possible for him through the Munich Agreement of 1938. In Moscow, The impression was created that London and Paris perhaps hoped that Hitler would direct his aggression eastwards and weaken the Soviet Union. Whether this assumption was true in this form or not, it shaped Stalin's mistrust. For him, an agreement with Germany could buy time, shift the Soviet borders to the west, and keep the Soviet Union out of an immediate war. Negotiations between the Western powers and the Soviet Union in the summer of 1939 were sluggish and marked by mutual mistrust. Britain and France, while looking for a way to deter Hitler, were unsure how far to go with Stalin. Poland, on the other hand, did not want to allow Soviet troops on its territory, even if this was supposedly for common defense. This attitude was understandable from the Polish point of view. The memory of the 1920 war against Soviet Russia was alive, and Warsaw feared that once Soviet troops in the country, they would not leave. It was precisely this mistrust that made an effective common front against Hitler almost impossible. While the Western talks seemed slow and indecisive, Berlin negotiated more directly and brutally. Hitler offered Stalin not only neutrality, but concrete gains. The publicly known part of the pact was a non-aggression agreement. Germany and the Soviet Union declared that they would not attack each other and would remain neutral in conflicts with third countries. That alone was remarkable enough. But the real core lay in a secret additional protocol. In this protocol, both powers divided Eastern Europe into spheres of interest. Poland was de facto put up for discussion between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Baltic states, Finland and Bessarabia were also included in these considerations of power politics. This not only concluded a treaty between two states, but also decided on the future of other countries without these countries being asked. It was a cynical act of imperial politics, in which maps were more important than people, self-determination and law. For Poland, this secret additional protocol was a disaster, even if its exact content was not initially publicly known. The country had always tried to preserve its independence through a balance between Germany and the Soviet Union. This balance has now collapsed. The worst case, which Polish politicians and military officials had feared for years, became reality. Berlin and Moscow agreed on Polish territory. This meant that Poland was no longer only faced with an aggressive Germany, but had to reckon with the fact that the Soviet Union would not help, but would take advantage of the situation. The strategic location of the country became almost hopeless. A war against Germany alone would have been difficult enough. An attack or pressure from both sides made a permanent defense almost impossible. The pact was also a serious blow to Western democracies. Britain and France had hoped to deter Hitler through guarantees and diplomacy. But the treaty with Stalin gave Hitler the feeling that he had eliminated the decisive risk factor. He could now assume that the Soviet Union would not cause him any problems in the back. At the same time, Germany was given the opportunity to count on Soviet raw materials. Economic agreements between Berlin and Moscow became important because Germany needed raw materials for a prolonged conflict, including oil, grain, and other strategic goods. The cooperation was therefore not only politically, but also economically significant. It helped Germany to initially cushion the consequences of a possible British blockade. The moral impact of the pact was enormous. Communists in many countries, who had previously passionately fought National Socialism, were suddenly faced with a political turnaround that was hardly explainable. National Socialists, on the other hand, had to justify why an agreement was concluded with the hated Bolshevism, of all people. Both regimes solved this problem in their own way. They presented the decision as clever statesmanship and concealed or distorted the deeper intentions. In dictatorships, the official line could change quickly because the press, parties, and the public were controlled. What was considered a deadly enemy yesterday could now temporarily appear as a contractor as long as it served power. This agility showed the coldness of the political leadership on both sides. Hitler himself did not regard the pact as a lasting understanding with the Soviet Union. For him, it was a tactical instrument. His long-term view remained directed to the East, and the Soviet Union remained a major enemy in his ideology. But in the summer of 1939, he needed Stalin to be able to isolate Poland. Stalin, on the other hand, deeply mistrusted Hitler, but believed that he would gain time and better position the Soviet Union strategically. Both dictators used the treaty because they believed they could outwit the other later. This mutual calculation did not make the pact stable in a moral or political sense. It was not an expression of trust, but of cynicism. That's exactly why he was so dangerous. For the people in Poland, the Baltic states, and other affected regions, these decisions posed an existential threat. Their lives were decided in secret conversations, far away from their parliaments, cities, and villages. The secret additional protocol turned Eastern Europe into a bargaining chip. States were not seen as sovereign communities, but as spaces that could be moved between great powers. This way of thinking was reminiscent of older forms of imperial politics, but it was now combined with the brutal methods of modern dictatorships. The coming war would not only pit armies against each other, but would also expose entire societies to violence, occupation, and political annihilation. In Berlin, the pact accelerated the last steps towards war. Hitler felt vindicated. Poland's diplomatic isolation seemed to have been successful, the danger of Soviet intervention averted, and the Western guarantees had less of a deterrent effect from his point of view. Although it was not ruled out that Great Britain and France would declare war on Germany, Hitler continued to believe that they would ultimately not act decisively or would be too late militarily. He relied on speed, surprise, and the weakness of his opponents. The pact with Stalin was the key that opened the way for him to attack. In Moscow, Stalin saw the situation just as coolly. The Soviet Union was initially able to wait and see how Germany and the Western powers would clash. At the same time, it was given the opportunity to expand its sphere of influence to the west. When the Red Army later marched into eastern Poland on September 17, 1939, it became apparent what was laid down in the secret additional protocol. The Soviet Union presented its invasion with its own justifications, but in fact it acted within the framework of the division previously agreed with Germany. Poland was smashed from two sides. The state, which had laboriously built up its independence since 1918, was once again the victim of a power political agreement between its neighbors. The Hitler-Stalin Pact was therefore much more than a diplomatic surprise. It was the moment when the attack on Poland became politically possible and militarily more likely. He destroyed the last hope that Germany could still be deterred by a common front of the great powers. He showed the weakness of an international order that was hardly able to assert itself against determined dictatorships. And he revealed that the ideological enmities of the 20th century could be overshadowed by cold power politics at any time. In the end, Poland was left alone in the face of a catastrophe that had been prepared in Berlin and Moscow. The pact did not eliminate all risks for Hitler, but it changed the balance decisively. Without Soviet neutrality and the secret division of Eastern Europe, the attack on Poland would have been much more dangerous for Germany, politically and militarily. With the agreement, however, Hitler believed that he had a free hand. Stalin believed that he was gaining time and space. Both were mistaken about controlling events in the long run, but in the short term, others paid the price. For Poland, the Hitler-Stalin Pact marked the beginning of the end of its state independence in 1939. For Europe, it was the dark omen of a war in which treaties did not bring peace, but made violence possible. Chapter 6: The Last Days Before the Attack. In the last days before September 1, 1939, there was an oppressive tension over Europe. Diplomats were negotiating, governments were sending embassies, newspapers were reporting new threats, armies were ready, and yet everything was moving seemingly inexorably towards war. It was a time when words still sounded like peace, while military decisions had long since been made. In Berlin, there was talk of Polish intransigence, of alleged provocations, and of German right-wingers. In Warsaw, they tried to show strength without giving the impression that they were looking for conflict. In London and Paris, it was still hoped that Hitler could be persuaded to give in through warnings and negotiations. But in the background, the German attack preparations continued. Diplomacy increasingly became a stage on which responsibility was to be shifted, while the Wehrmacht was already waiting for the order to strike. Hitler had long since decided to go to war against Poland. The demands for Gdansk and a connection through the corridor were no longer intended as a real basis for negotiations, but served as political preparation. The Nazi regime wanted to create the impression that Germany had patiently tried to find a just solution, but had been prevented from doing so by Poland and its Western supporters. This portrayal was central to the propaganda. Hitler knew that an open war of aggression was difficult to justify, even in a society that had been sworn to nationalism, obedience, and enemy images for years. Therefore, Poland had to appear as a troublemaker. It was intended to make it seem as if Germany had no choice but to act militarily. The Polish government was in an extraordinarily difficult situation. It knew that Germany was militarily superior and that the German leadership was becoming increasingly aggressive. At the same time, Warsaw could not simply give in without endangering its own sovereignty. A concession on the Danzig question would probably not have secured peace, but would have increased Hitler's appetite. The experience of Czechoslovakia was too recent to be ignored. There, too, the Western powers had believed that they could avoid war by making concessions. The result was not stability, but the destruction of a state. Poland did not want to go down the same path. Foreign Minister Josef Beck and the Polish leadership therefore maintained that practical issues could be negotiated, but not at the expense of independence. Great Britain and France had given Poland guarantees in the spring of 1939. These guarantees were politically significant, but militarily problematic. They signaled to Hitler that an attack on Poland would no longer be treated as a local conflict. But they did not mean that British or French troops could immediately fight on the Polish border. Poland initially had to stand up on its own in an emergency. The Western powers could declare war on Germany, but their direct exoneration of Poland would be slow and uncertain. This is exactly what Hitler was counting on. He believed that London and Paris would protest, perhaps even react formally, but not quickly enough to prevent the German victory in Poland. This assessment was risky, but it was in line with his previous experience. Again and again he had experienced that his opponents hesitated. After the conclusion of the Hitler-Stalin Pact on August 23, 1939, the crisis accelerated dramatically. For Hitler, the most important factor of uncertainty was now removed. The Soviet Union would not threaten Germany in the rear. Moreover, Poland had already been divided between Berlin and Moscow by the secret additional protocol, at least on the paper of power politics. The news of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact came as a shock to the Western capitals. It showed that the hope for a common deterrent front against Hitler had failed. For Poland, the situation was now even more dangerous. Although the secret content of the pact was not known exactly, the sudden agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union alone was an alarm signal. The state, which lay between these two powers, had to understand that its strategic position had become almost hopeless. Nevertheless, even in the last days of August, the war was not simply a mechanical process. There were still diplomatic contacts, embassies, mediation attempts, and warnings. On the one hand, Great Britain tried not to pressure Poland to give in dangerously, but on the other hand, to keep a last possibility of negotiation open. The British government made it clear to Germany that it would stand by its obligations in the event of an attack. At the same time, it was hoped that a way out might still be found through talks. Hitler, in turn, took advantage of this indecision. He made offers and demands appear as if Germany was ready for talks, but set conditions and deadlines that hardly allowed for serious negotiations. The German side staged diplomacy, while military planning was already geared towards execution. A special example of this tactic was the handling of German demands at the end of August. Berlin presented alleged proposals, but in practice demanded that Poland make immediate decisions under massive pressure. The Polish government was to be put in a situation where it could either accept humiliating conditions or be portrayed as a refuser. This method corresponded to Hitler's style. He put the opponent under time pressure, increased the threat, and then claimed that the other side had blocked any peaceful solution. In reality, Poland's room for maneuver had been deliberately restricted. True diplomacy takes time, trust, and reliable intentions. None of this was present in these last days. While diplomatic talks were still underway, the Wehrmacht was preparing the attack. The German operational plan was to invade Poland from several directions. Troops were ready in the west, in East Prussia and in the south after Germany had gained an additional starting position through the breakup of Czechoslovakia. The Luftwaffe was prepared for attacks against airfields, transport hubs, cities and military targets. Tank units and motorized units were to advance quickly, separate Polish armies from each other and make orderly defense more difficult. These plans showed that the war was not improvised. It was prepared, organized and politically wanted. Military measures were also taken in Poland, but the mobilization was politically sensitive. Warsaw had to prepare its armed forces, but did not want to give Germany an excuse to portray Poland as the aggressor. In addition, the Western powers at times exerted pressure to handle the Polish mobilization cautiously so as not to provoke Hitler any further. This restraint had dangerous consequences. Every delay weakened the Polish readiness. In a crisis in which Germany was already fully prepared for attack, political caution could become militarily expensive. Poland was faced with a dilemma that on the one hand it had to organize its defense, but on the other hand it wanted to avoid appearing as a warmonger in the international public. German propaganda was working at full speed during these days. Newspapers and radio broadcast reports about alleged Polish attacks on Germans, mistreatment of German minorities, and an alleged threat to the Reich. Many of these depictions were exaggerated, invented, or deliberately distorted. Its purpose was not enlightenment, but mobilization. The German population was supposed to believe that Poland was aggressive and that Germany was only reacting. This reversal of perpetrator and victim was typical of National Socialist war propaganda. It was intended to numb moral doubts and make the attack appear as a defense. At the same time, the propaganda was also directed abroad. If there was enough confusion, if enough doubt was sown about Poland's behavior, then perhaps Berlin hoped to undermine the resolve of the Western democracies. In truth, the decision had long since been made. Hitler had initially planned the attack for August 26, but postponed it at short notice. The reason was, among other things, that Great Britain and Poland were consolidating their mutual commitment and that Mussolini was signaling that Italy was not ready for an immediate major war. This shift shows that Hitler did calculate tactically. He was not blind to risks. But he did not draw the conclusion from this to give up the war. Instead, he let the preparations continue and looked for a more favorable political situation. The days leading up to September 1st thus became a final phase of tense anticipation, in which everyone knew that something was imminent, but no one was sure whether it could still be stopped. For the people of Poland, these days were marked by uncertainty. Many sensed that war could be coming, but the exact timing remained unclear. Families worried about conscripted men, cities prepared air raid shelters, authorities tried to maintain order, and yet normal life went on in many places. This is precisely where an oppressive truth of historical crises lies. The transition from peace to war does not always happen with a single visible break. Often people still live in routines, while decisions have already been made about them. In Berlin, Moscow, London, Paris, and Warsaw, maps were read, telegrams were sent, and orders were prepared, while ordinary people hoped that reason might prevail after all. But reason no longer had a real place in Hitler's plan. What seemed to the outside world like a crisis over negotiations was essentially the preparation of a war of aggression. The last days before the attack therefore show particularly clearly how war is not only created by weapons, but by deception, language, staging, and calculated escalation. Germany did not want to simply fight. It wanted to start the war in such a way that its own responsibility was concealed. Poland was supposed to appear unreasonable, the Western powers as the culprits of an escalation, and Germany as a power that supposedly only defended its rights. By the end of August 1939, Europe had reached a point where diplomacy was almost a facade. The treaties, warnings, and conversations could no longer conceal the fact that Hitler wanted war and that Stalin had made his way easier through the pact. Poland was under pressure, but it refused to submit. Britain and France warned, but they could not prevent the attack. The Wehrmacht waited for the order, propaganda prepared the justification, and the secret services organized pretexts. In these last days, the whole tragedy of the European order of 1939 became apparent. Many wanted to avoid war, but the power lay with those who deliberately brought it about. Thus, September 1st did not become a sudden accident of history, but the result of a long escalation. The last days before the attack were marked by fear, deception, and political calculation. They were the short, gloomy threshold between a fragile peace order and a war that was soon to change the world. When the German troops finally marched off and the first shots were fired, not only a diplomatic crisis ended. The illusion that Hitler's power politics could still be tamed by concessions, warnings, or final talks ended. Chapter 7: The Staged Pretext. A war of aggression rarely begins with the first shot. It often begins before that, in the words, images, and stories that a government tells its people. This is exactly what happened in August 1939. National Socialist Germany had long since prepared the war against Poland, but Hitler did not want to openly present it for what it was: a planned attack on a sovereign state in violation of international law. Instead, the impression was to be created that Germany had become a victim of Polish violence and now had to defend itself. This reversal of perpetrator and victim was a central element of National Socialist propaganda. The war should not appear as conquest, but as a necessary response to alleged provocations. In order to make this lie seem credible, the regime staged a series of border incidents. The most famous of these was the attack on the Gliwice transmitter. Gliwice was located in Upper Silesia, near the German-Polish border. There was a German radio station there, which became the scene of a carefully planned deception operation on the evening of August 31st, 1939. Men of the SS, posing as Polish attackers, forced their way into the facility. The aim was to create the impression that Polish forces had entered German territory and carried out an attack on a German facility. A short message was spread over the station, which was intended to give the appearance of a Polish appeal. The action was militarily insignificant, but politically highly symbolic. It was intended to create an image: Poland is attacking, Germany is reacting. So simple, so effective, so wrong. The staging of Gliwice was part of a larger operation that became known as Operation Himmler. This designation refers to Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, whose apparatus played a central role in the preparation of such deceptive actions. It was not just a single incident, but a whole series of fictitious events along the border. German authorities wanted to create evidence that was none. Alleged Polish raids, shootings, attacks on facilities, and border violations were to be collected and used for propaganda purposes. The regime wanted to use it to morally disguise the war. Anyone who later asked why Germany had attacked Poland was to receive a prepared answer: because Poland had provoked first. It is particularly shocking that people were also murdered in these actions to make the deception more credible. Prisoners from concentration camps or other victims were dressed in Polish uniforms or presented as alleged attackers. In the cynical language of the perpetrators, such victims were sometimes treated as pieces of evidence. Her death was supposed to authenticate a lie. Here, the moral brutality of the National Socialist system was already evident before the war began. Human lives no longer had any value of their own for the perpetrators. They were used, moved, killed, and incorporated into a political staging. The war against Poland thus began not only with military force, but with murder, deception, and the complete contempt for human dignity. For Hitler, the question of pretext was important, but not because he really needed a legal basis. He had long since made up his mind. But dictatorships, despite their violence, live on narratives. They too have to explain why sacrifices should be made, why soldiers die, why families send their sons to the front, and why a country goes to war. The population should not have the feeling that they are following a cold plan of conquest. She was supposed to believe that Germany was threatened. For years, propaganda had painted the picture of an unjust Europe that encircled Germany, humiliated it, and deprived it of its rights. Now Poland has been inserted into this narrative. In the German media, a threatened neighbor has become an allegedly aggressive state that mistreats German minorities and violates German borders. This propaganda was effective because it tied in with existing feelings. Many Germans felt that the Treaty of Versailles was an injustice. Many had learned to regard Gdansk and the corridor as wounds of the nation. Many have been hearing for years that Germany must become strong again and must no longer allow itself to be humiliated. In this atmosphere, it was easier to believe invented Polish attacks. Propaganda rarely works just by inventing a completely new lie. It is often particularly dangerous when it picks up on existing fears, insults, and prejudices and steers them in a desired direction. This is exactly what the National Socialist regime did. It built up an image in which Germany did not appear as an aggressor, but as a patient power that had allegedly been provoked for too long. The staged pretext also had a function in foreign policy. Hitler knew that Britain and France had given guarantees to Poland. He couldn't be sure how quickly and decisively they would react. That is why it was useful to sow doubt. If the impression arose abroad that the situation was confusing, if both sides were held responsible for the escalation, or if Poland appeared to be an accomplice, this could weaken political resolve. Especially in democracies, where governments had to take into account public opinion, parliaments, and the press, confusion could buy time. And time was crucial to Hitler's plan. Poland was to be defeated quickly before the Western powers could intervene militarily. The deceptive actions also show how closely violence and bureaucracy were linked in the National Socialist state. The attack on Poland was not just a decision by Hitler alone, even if he was the central driving force. Many institutions were involved: the Wehrmacht, the SS, the security service, propaganda offices, diplomats, administrative authorities, and party organs. Each area fulfilled its task. The soldiers prepared the military strike. The SS organized fictitious incidents and repression. Propaganda shaped the public narrative. Diplomacy claimed to the outside world that it was willing to negotiate. This created a closed system of deception in which the truth played no role as long as the political effect was right. On the morning of September 1, 1939, Hitler took up exactly this narrative in his speech to the Reichstag. He spoke of the fact that people have been shooting back since a certain time. This sentence became infamous because it carried the whole lie of the attack. Germany did not shoot back. Germany had started the war. The Wehrmacht crossed Polish borders, the Luftwaffe attacked targets in the country, and the battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on Westerplatte. But in Hitler's account, it sounded as if Germany had been forced to defend itself. This deliberate distortion was intended to turn the attack into an act of self-defense. It was not formulated by chance, but part of a prepared political theater. For Poland, this staging was particularly bitter. The country was not only militarily attacked, but also slandered for propaganda. While German troops overran Polish territory, Poland had to fight against the image of being the trigger of the war itself. This double violence is part of the history of the Polish campaign. Wars are not only fought on battlefields, but also in people's minds. Those who control the interpretation can shift guilt, make victims invisible, and justify crimes. National Socialist Germany understood this power of narrative very well. That is why the attack began not only with tanks and planes, but also with lies. The international public did not immediately fully understand many German claims, but Germany's fundamental responsibility was clear enough. Great Britain and France could not be permanently convinced by the claim of a Polish attack. The German preparation was too obvious, the escalation of the past months too clear, Hitler's method of first demanding, then threatening and finally striking was too familiar. Nevertheless, the propaganda at home served its purpose. It gave the German population a simple explanation and suppressed the inconvenient truth that their own country had started a war that would plunge millions of people into ruin. The Gleiwitz transmitter therefore became a symbol, not because this single incident was militarily decisive, but because it made the structure of the coming war visible. The National Socialist leadership was prepared to falsify reality, murder people, and slander entire peoples in order to achieve their goals. The violence did not only begin after the border was crossed. It already began with a lie that was supposed to justify the border crossing. Gliwice shows how a modern state with media, secret services, and military planning could create an illusory reality in which attack appeared as defense. This method had long-term significance. The Second World War was repeatedly accompanied by propaganda, false claims, dehumanizing enemy images, and the targeted manipulation of the public. In the case of Poland, all this was evident from the very beginning. The Polish population was not portrayed as a community of people defending their country, but as a threat, as a troublemaker, as an obstacle to German order. Such images later facilitated the occupation violence. Anyone who dehumanizes the opponent beforehand lowers the inhibition threshold for crime. That is why the staging of the pretext is not just a footnote in the history of diplomacy. It is a key to understanding the violence that followed. In the end, the attack on the Gliwice transmitter was a small event compared to the size of the war, which it was supposed to justify. But this is precisely where its importance lies. A few minutes of false radio, a few men in disguise, prepared corpses, fabricated accusations, and a propaganda machine were enough to give the appearance of a cause to an aggression that had already been decided. The war would have come even without Gliwice, because Hitler wanted it. But Gliwice showed how this war was to be told. Not as a crime, but as an answer. Not as conquest, but as protection. Not as an attack, but as alleged self-defense. Anyone who looks at the Polish campaign must therefore not only look at maps, troop movements, and military decisions. You also have to pay attention to the language with which violence was prepared. The staged pretext was the moment when the lie officially became the door of war. Behind her, tanks, bombs, occupation, and terror awaited. When the German attacks began the next morning, the story of the Polish attack was already ready. But the truth was different. Poland had not started a world war. Poland became the first victim of a war that Hitler had planned, prepared, and opened with a lie. Chapter 8, September 1st, 1939. The morning of September 1st, 1939 did not begin like an ordinary day of war, because officially there was still peace in Europe. There was no formal declaration of war by Germany on Poland, no last honest diplomatic break, no clear warning that would have given the people in the towns and villages time to prepare for what was about to befall them. Instead, the attack began at dawn, fast, coordinated, and with a coldness that was to characterize the entire campaign. German troops crossed the Polish border, Luftwaffe planes attacked targets in the interior, and the guns of the German warship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire at Westerplatte near Danzig. Within a few hours, a political crisis turned into a war. And this war against Poland turned into the beginning of the Second World War a little later. Westerplatte became one of the first symbols of the day. There was a Polish ammunition depot on a narrow strip of land in the area of the free city of Gdansk. The Polish occupation was small and militarily not intended to withstand a massive attack for long. But when the Schleswig-Holstein opened fire in the early morning, this outpost became a place of resistance. The German attackers expected the position to fall quickly. But the Polish defenders held out, despite shelling, despite infantry attacks, and despite the hopelessness of their situation. Their defense had little influence on the overall course of the campaign, but it took on enormous moral significance. Westerplatte showed that Poland would not go down without a fight. It became a symbol of a state that retained its dignity despite its superiority. At the same time, the war began not only on the coast. German units advanced on many sections of the long border. The Wehrmacht attacked from different directions, from the west, from East Prussia in the north, and from the south, where Germany had additional starting positions after the breakup of Czechoslovakia. This multi-front situation was particularly dangerous for Poland. The country had to defend a very large space, while its armies were pulled apart by the shape of the borders. German planners wanted to take advantage of exactly that. They wanted to cut up the Polish forces, achieve quick breakthroughs, and prevent the Polish army from retreating to a deeper line of defense in an orderly manner. Speed was crucial. The attack was not only intended to hit Poland militarily, but also to paralyze it politically. The importance of the Luftwaffe was already evident in the first few hours. German planes attacked airports, train stations, roads, bridges, communication centers, and cities. The aim was to disrupt Polish mobilization, delay troop movements, and weaken the link between the front, leadership, and supplies. But the airstrikes also had a psychological effect. They meant a shock for the civilian population. People who had lived the night before in the hope that the crisis might still be resolved now heard engine noises, explosions, and sirens. The war was not slowly approaching, it was falling from the sky. This experience in particular was new for many people. Modern warfare meant that it was no longer just soldiers on a distant front who were affected. Cities, transport routes, and civilians became part of the war from the very beginning. The attack on Wielin, a Polish city that was bombed in the early morning, became particularly notorious. The destruction hit civilian areas hard and later became a symbol of the brutality of the German air war against Poland. Whether individual targets were militarily justified or not, for the people on the ground, the experience was clear. Bombs fell on a city, houses were destroyed, residents died, and the war immediately showed its face as violence against the defenseless. September 1st was therefore not only the beginning of a military campaign. It was also the beginning of a war in which the boundary between the front and the homeland, between soldier and civilian, was becoming increasingly blurred. The Polish army resisted the attack with great commitment, but its situation was difficult from the beginning. Poland had positioned its troops relatively far forward, also so as not to give up important areas, cities, and industrial centers without a fight. Politically, this was understandable. A state that defends its independence cannot easily explain why it immediately surrenders large parts of its territory. Militarily, however, this decision was risky. The German attacks were aimed at encircling Polish units and cutting off retreat routes. In addition, the Wehrmacht was better motorized in many areas, had stronger air support, and could lead its units faster by radio. This did not mean that every German attack went smoothly or that Polish soldiers fought poorly. On the contrary, in many places they put up fierce resistance. But they fought under conditions that suited the German mode of operation. Hitler spoke to the Reichstag on the same day and presented the attack as a defense. The sentence that there has been shooting back since a certain time was intended to create the impression that Germany had only reacted to Polish attacks. In truth, it was the deliberate lie of an aggressor. The war had been planned, prepared, and propagandistically secured by fictitious incidents. The speech was part of the staging. While German troops had long been on Polish soil, the leadership in Berlin tried to shift responsibility. This interplay of military attack and political deception was typical of the beginning of the campaign. The violence was not only perpetrated, it was also disguised linguistically. In Warsaw and other Polish cities, it quickly became clear that the country was in an existential struggle. The government called for defense, the army tried to slow down the German advances, and the population reacted with fear, determination, and confusion at the same time. Many people had hoped that the alliances with Britain and France would deter Hitler. Now they were waiting for help from the West. But this help could not come immediately. Although London and Paris had given guarantees, on September 1st Poland fought practically alone. This realization was bitter. Political support was important, but on the fronts, what counted most in these hours were troops, planes, tanks, ammunition, and time. The German attack was not equally successful everywhere, but it quickly developed a dynamic. Tanks and motorized units advanced, infantry followed, airstrikes disrupted Polish movements, and the German leadership tried to turn local breakthroughs into major operational successes. The Wehrmacht benefited from close coordination between different branches of the armed forces. Tanks alone do not win war, nor do planes alone. The decisive factor was the combination of movement, firepower, communication, and surprise. In Poland, a form of modern operations was emerging, which was later often associated with the term Blitzkrieg. However, this term should not give the impression that everything was automatic or effortless. German successes were based on planning, superiority in important areas, and Poland's unfavorable location. But they were also based on the fact that the Polish leadership had hardly any time to react to the speed of the attack. For the soldiers on both sides, September 1st was not an abstract date, but a day full of noise, dust, smoke, and uncertainty. Polish units had to march under air raids, hold positions, understand retreat orders, or repel attacks. German soldiers moved into a country that had often been portrayed to them as hostile and inferior by propaganda. This dehumanization was dangerous because it lowered inhibitions. Attacks and violence against civilians occurred early on. The campaign was not simply a clean military competition. From the very beginning, it was embedded in an ideology that did not respect Poland as an equal opponent, but regarded it as a space to be subjugated. Internationally, the attack caused consternation. Britain and France were now faced with the question of whether their guarantees were still credible. If they accepted Hitler's attack, any further promise would have been worthless. But on September 1st itself, they still tried to influence Germany by means of ultimatums and diplomatic steps. In Berlin, they may still have hoped that the West would hesitate despite all the warnings. Hitler had repeatedly counted on the fact that his opponents would shy away from war in the end. This hope was only partially fulfilled. Although Great Britain and France did not immediately intervene in Poland with full force, they would declare war on Germany a few days later. Thus, the conflict finally exceeded the framework of a German-Polish war. September 1st, 1939 was therefore a day with several levels. The German attack on Poland began militarily. Politically, the last illusion that Hitler could be controlled by negotiation was shattered. Morally, the lie with which a war of aggression was sold as self-defense was revealed. For the Polish population, a time of flight, bombing, occupation, and loss began. For Europe, the path to war began that would soon touch almost all continents. Many people did not yet suspect the full extent of the coming catastrophe. Little did they know that this war would last for years, destroy states, kill millions of people, and make the Holocaust possible. But they felt that a line had been crossed. The first shots fired on Westerplatte, the bombs on Polish cities, the border crossings by German troops, and the propaganda lies from Berlin combined to form a historic moment that reached far beyond Poland. The peace of 1919, as fragile and imperfect as it had been, finally collapsed. The order that was supposed to stabilize Europe after the First World War could not withstand the violent policy of National Socialism. Poland became the first battlefield of this new war, not because it had sought war, but because it stood in the way of Hitler's claim to power. At the end of the day, nothing had been decided, but everything had changed. Poland continued to fight, Westerplatte held. The world looked to Warsaw, London, Paris, and Berlin. People are waiting for news, for decisions, for help, or for orders. But the step into the abyss was taken. September 1st, 1939 was not only the beginning of the Polish campaign. It was the day when a regional attack became the threshold of a world war. And while the National Socialist leadership claimed that it was only shooting back, reality showed otherwise. Germany had set Europe on fire. Chapter 9. Blitzkrieg as a new form of war. The Polish campaign was later often described as the first major example of the so-called Blitzkrieg. To this day, this word evokes images of racing tank tops, dive bombers, collapsing fronts, and overwhelmed opponents. But if you really want to understand the term, you must not misunderstand it as a simple miracle weapon. Germany's success in Poland was not based on a single new technology, nor on the fact that tanks alone had suddenly decided the war. The decisive factor was the interaction of different forces: fast armored formations, motorized infantry, air force, artillery, radio communications, reconnaissance, and a leadership that did not slowly push the enemy back, but confused him, cut him up, and destroyed his decision-making ability. The Polish campaign thus showed a new form of operational warfare that had learned from experiences of the First World War and at the same time met the weaknesses of the Polish situation. During the First World War, the fronts in the West had been frozen for years. Millions of soldiers were in trenches, while attacks often brought only a few kilometers of territorial gain and caused enormous losses. Artillery, machine guns, barbed wire, and poor mobility had turned the war into a bloody battle of attrition. After 1918, the military of many countries looked for ways to overcome this rigidity. In Germany, too, people thought intensively about how a future war could be decided more quickly. In the 1930s, the Wehrmacht developed a mode of operation that focused on movement, surprise, and concentration of forces. The opponent should not be attacked evenly everywhere, but should be broken through with great force at selected points. According to this, fast formations were to advance deep into the rear, disrupt communication routes, threaten command posts, and encircle enemy troops. The tank played a central role in this, but not as an isolated weapon. Tanks were mobile, relatively well protected, and could quickly get firepower to a crucial location. But without fuel, ammunition, repair services, infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support, they would have been vulnerable. In Poland in particular, it became clear that modern warfare required organization. Tank formations had to be coordinated, they had to know where to advance, and they had to be able to react flexibly when resistance was stronger than expected. Radios became particularly important here. While older armies were often cumbersomely dependent on orders from higher staffs, German commanders were able to exchange information more quickly and redirect units. This speed in communication increased the speed on the battlefield. The Luftwaffe was another decisive factor. It was intended not only to fight enemy aircraft, but also to destroy the enemy's mobility. Attacks on railway stations, bridges, roads, columns, airfields, and command posts were intended to prevent Poland from deploying reserves in time and building a stable defense. Especially the dive bombers, the so-called Stukas, had a strong psychological effect. Their siren sound, the howling during the dive, and the sudden explosion of the bombs created fear and chaos. Even if the actual military effect varied depending on the target, the psychological effect was enormous. Soldiers and civilians experienced the war as something that no longer came only from the front, but from above and from all sides at the same time. The German leadership planned the attack on Poland in such a way that the geographical location of the country was exploited. Poland was particularly difficult to defend due to its borders. East Prussia was like a German outpost in the north. In the west ran a long border with the German Reich, and in the south Germany was also able to provide forces after the occupation of Czechoslovakia. This allowed Poland to be attacked from several directions. The German armies were not simply to march frontally, but to encompass Polish formations, separate them from each other, and enclose them in cauldrons. The goal was not only to gain territory, but also to destroy the Polish army as a force capable of acting. For Poland, this kind of war was particularly dangerous because its own defense was under difficult conditions. The Polish army had brave soldiers and many experienced officers, but it was less motorized, weaker in the air, and technically poorly equipped in some areas. A large part of the Polish units were dependent on horses, railways, and marches. This did not mean that Poland was old-fashioned or incapable of fighting. The idea that Polish cavalry senselessly attacked tanks with sabers is one of the most persistent myths of the Second World War and distorts reality. Polish cavalry was often mobile infantry, which used horses primarily for rapid deployment and usually fought dismounted in battle. The real problem lay not so much in alleged backwardness, but in the unequal industrial and military starting position. The Wehrmacht was able to achieve breakthroughs in several places because it concentrated forces and put enormous pressure on the Polish leadership. If a front line was breached at any point, Polish commanders had to decide whether to hold, retreat, or deploy reserves. But due to air raids, destroyed communications, and rapid German advances, orders often arrived late or were already outdated when they arrived. This was exactly one of the most important effects of the Blitzkrieg principle. The opponent was not only to be defeated physically, but mentally overwhelmed. The speed of events should paralyze his ability to respond meaningfully. While a Polish unit was still trying to hold a front, German leaders could already appear in their rear. This dynamic led to the war having a chaotic effect on many Polish soldiers. They fought resolutely and successfully in individual places, but could hardly influence the overall picture when neighboring units were pushed back or traffic routes were lost. Local courage did not replace surgical agility. A unit could bravely defend a position and still be in danger of being cut off. The German strategy aimed precisely at this separation between tactical resistance and strategic situation. Poland was not to be destroyed everywhere at once, but her armies were to be brought into a situation in which retreat, supplies, and coordination became increasingly difficult. But German warfare also had its limits. The Polish campaign was not the flawless, effortless advance that propaganda later often portrayed it as. There was resistance, delays, losses, supply problems, and wrong decisions. Many German vehicles were by no means technically superior, and a large part of the Wehrmacht continued to rely on horses. Even the German army was not yet fully motorized in 1939. The difference was that the decisive fast forces were used in a concentrated manner. The Wehrmacht was altogether more modern in its operational management, but it was not a perfect mechanical apparatus. This is precisely why it is important to take a sober look at the term Blitzkrieg. He describes less a ready-made doctrine with a single name than a combination of mobile warfare, air support, radio guidance, risk-taking, and the political goal of quickly crushing the enemy. Hitler himself drew dangerous conclusions from the success in Poland. The quick victory confirmed his belief that determined force and military speed could solve political problems. Many German generals also saw their methods confirmed. The campaign seemed to prove that Germany could defeat its opponents before their alliances took effect. This conclusion influenced the next steps of the war. In 1940, the Wehrmacht was once again to rely on quick breakthroughs and operational surprises in the West. But the success in Poland was also based on special conditions: Poland's geographical vulnerability, the lack of immediate relief from the Western powers, and the subsequent Soviet intervention. Anyone who derived a general guarantee of German invincibility from this overlooked the risks. For the Polish population, this new form of war meant a frightening experience. The advance was not slow and clearly predictable. Cities and villages could suddenly come close to the front. Columns of refugees were threatened by airstrikes. News contradicted each other, and the state order came under pressure. The war moved faster than people could flee, authorities could react, and armies could reorganize. It was precisely this that created a feeling of collapse. The Blitzkrieg was not only a military method, but also a psychological shock. He was supposed to take away the opponent's feeling that he still had control over the situation. At the same time, it should not be forgotten that this form of war in Poland was already associated with ideological violence. The rapid advance opened up spaces for occupation, arrests, shootings, and repression. Behind the fighting troops followed units and authorities that pursued political goals. So the military success was not neutral. He created the prerequisites for brutal rule. While maps and the rods showed lines of advance, those same lines meant the loss of freedom, security, and often lives for the people on the ground. The modern mobility of the Wehrmacht was combined with an occupation policy that did not treat Poland as an equal country. The term Blitzkrieg can therefore easily be deceptive if it only means speed. In Poland, speed was a means to a greater end. The German leadership wanted to crush Poland militarily before Great Britain and France could intervene effectively. It wanted to destroy the Polish state politically, encircle the army, and bring society into a state of defenselessness. Tanks, planes, and radio were tools of this intention. The real innovation lay in the combination of technology, organization, and political will. The war became not only faster, but also deeper. It hit the front, rear, leadership, infrastructure, and civilian population at the same time. In the end, the Polish campaign showed how dangerous a modern army could be when it was combined with aggressive ideology and ruthless strategy. The Wehrmacht proved that rapid operations could shake a state in a short time. At the same time, Poland proved that military defeat was not the same as a lack of courage. The Polish soldiers fought under unfavorable conditions against a power that was not only superiorly armed, but also waged the war according to a new rhythm. The Blitzkrieg was therefore not simply a story of German strength. It was also a story of Polish overwhelm by circumstances that hardly any state could have coped with alone. Thus, Chapter 9 of the Polish campaign became a lesson in modern warfare. Speed did not replace violence, it increased it. Technology did not replace politics, it served it. And military innovation did not mean progress in the human sense, but could only make destruction more efficient. The attack on Poland showed that the coming World War would be fought differently from the previous one. Not as years of freezing from the beginning, but as movement, shock, breakthrough, and collapse. But behind the seemingly modern term Blitzkrieg there was an old truth. When power acts without law, every technical innovation becomes a tool of submission. Chapter 10. The Polish Army in Battle. In September 1939, the Polish army was faced with a task that was almost impossible. It had to defend a state whose borders were long, vulnerable, and strategically unfavorable. It had to fight against a German Wehrmacht that was better prepared for mobile warfare, had a strong air force, and could lead its attacks from several directions. At the same time, Poland had to hope that Britain and France would take their guarantees seriously and put pressure on Germany in the West. But in the decisive first few days, this relief failed to materialize. This created a situation in which bravery, sacrifice, and patriotic will were visible everywhere, but could not compensate for the structural disadvantages. The Polish army did not fight lost because it lacked courage. It fought lost because it was sandwiched between military superiority, geographical vulnerability, and political isolation from the very beginning. After 1918, Poland had made great efforts to build up its own army. This structure was difficult because the new state had to bring together armed forces from very different traditions. Many officers and soldiers had previously served in the armies of the partitioning powers, i.e. in Russian, Austro-Hungarian, or German structures. After regaining independence, it had to become a national army, with unified leadership, common training, its own doctrine, and clear identity. The war against Soviet Russia had given the young army experience and self-confidence. The victory before Warsaw in 1920 became a centerpiece of Polish military memory. He showed that Poland could stand up to a powerful opponent when leadership, determination, and national mobilization worked together. But the world of 1939 was different from that of 1920. Motorization, air warfare, tank formations, and modern communication had changed the pace of the war. The Polish leadership knew well that Germany was dangerous. It was not blind to the rearmament of the Reich, and also not naive to Hitler's intentions. But knowledge alone does not create the means. Poland did not have the industrial power, economic resources, and time to modernize its armed forces at the same pace as Germany. Many Polish units were well trained and ready to fight, but they were often less agile. The supply depended heavily on railways, horse-drawn carriages, and poorly developed roads. Modern tanks and aircraft were available, but in too few numbers and often not in the necessary concentration. While the Wehrmacht was able to assemble rapid units at crucial points, Poland had to protect a broad front. This led to the fact that Polish forces were distributed instead of forming a strong reserve at a few points. A fundamental problem was the defense strategy. Poland was faced with the question of whether to deploy its army far along the borders or to retreat deeper inland. A defense near the border had political and economic reasons. Many important cities, industrial areas, and population centers were located in the west. If they were abandoned immediately, it would have weakened morale, made mobilization more difficult, and left large areas to Germany without a fight. In addition, Poland wanted to show that it would defend its entire territory. But militarily, this decision was risky. The border was too long, and the German attacks from the north, west, and south could involve Polish units. A deeper defense might have given more operational space, but it was politically difficult to enforce and also not a safe solution. Poland was thus faced with a choice in which every possibility had serious disadvantages. When the German attack began, it hit the Polish army at a moment of high tension. The mobilization was not fully completed, partly because political consideration had been given to the international situation. They did not want to provide Germany with a pretext and at the same time had to pay attention to the mediation of the Western powers. These delays were militarily unfavorable. Some units were still on their way to their intended positions when the Wehrmacht was already attacking. Air raids on railway stations and transport routes made the relocation even more difficult. This meant that Poland could not react with full force everywhere. The war did not begin under ideal conditions, but in a situation in which the German side set the time and Poland had to react. Nevertheless, Polish troops put up determined resistance in many places. They fought at border positions, in forests, on rivers, in cities and on lines of retreat. Individual battles showed that the Wehrmacht was by no means advancing effortlessly everywhere. Polish soldiers defended positions with great severity, attacked, delayed German units and demonstrated discipline under heavy pressure. The defense of Westerplatte, the battles at Mlawa, the Battle of the Bzura and the resistance in Warsaw became examples of this determination. The Battle of the Bzura in particular showed that the Polish army could also act offensively. There, Polish units attacked German forces and temporarily disrupted the German advance. But even such successes could not turn the overall development around, because German air superiority, fast reserves, and the operational situation ultimately worked against Poland. The Luftwaffe was one of the decisive factors. It not only attacked military targets, but also disrupted movements, supplies, and communications. For an army that relied on railways and roads, destroyed junctions were devastating. Orders arrived late, situation pictures became unclear, units lost contact with the leadership or neighbors. Modern warfare meant that an army could not only be defeated where it fought directly. She could also be paralyzed by destroying her connections. This is exactly what Poland experienced. Even brave frontline troops could do little if they did not know where the enemy stood, whether the flanks were still secured or whether retreat routes were already threatened. An often distorted topic is the Polish cavalry. In German propaganda and later in many popular depictions, the image of Polish horsemen riding against German tanks with sabers was created. This image is misleading and has been turned into a symbol of alleged Polish backwardness. In fact, cavalry in the Polish army was primarily a mobile troop that used horses for quick movement, but usually fought dismounted in battle. It had modern weapons such as machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and artillery support, although not always in sufficient quantities. Individual cavalry actions were exploited for propaganda purposes in order to ridicule Poland. But this presentation conceals the real problems. It was not courage or understanding that was lacking, but industrial strength, air protection, motorization, and operational mobility to a sufficient extent. The Polish commanders had to make decisions under extreme pressure. Retreat could be necessary, but it could also turn into chaos when roads were blocked by refugees, destroyed vehicles, and bombing. Holding could be honorable and tactically sensible, but it could also lead to encirclement when German units pushed past the flanks. Every decision had risks. In addition, there was uncertainty about the Soviet attitude. Although the Hitler-Stalin Pact was known, his secret additional protocol was not. Nevertheless, the Polish leadership had to fear that the Soviet Union could take advantage of the situation. When the Red Army actually marched into eastern Poland on September 17th, the strategic basis finally collapsed. From that moment on, the Polish army was no longer fighting only against a superior opponent in the West, but against the reality of a division by two great powers. For the ordinary soldiers, the campaign meant a mixture of a sense of duty, exhaustion, fear, and despair. Many struggled without knowing the bigger picture. They only knew that their country had been attacked and that their families, towns, and villages were threatened. In this sense, Polish defense was not only a military act, but also a national act. The army embodied the will of a state that had only been independent again for 2 decades and was now to be smashed again by its neighbors. This is precisely why resistance became important even after the defeat. He showed that Poland did not disappear voluntarily. The state structures were defeated, but the idea of Polish independence remained alive. The defeat of the Polish army was therefore not an expression of a simple military failure. It was the result of a superimposition of many factors. Germany had chosen the timing, the operational initiative, the stronger air force, greater mobility, and the advantage of several directions of attack. Poland had unfavorable borders, incomplete mobilization, limited modernization, and allies who did not intervene militarily quickly enough. When the Soviet Union came along, a difficult situation became a hopeless one. Nevertheless, the Polish army continued to fight as long and where it could. Units retreated to Romania or Hungary. Soldiers later escaped to France and Great Britain. Others went underground. The struggle did not end with the collapse of the fronts. This is precisely the historical significance of the Polish army in September 1939. It could not save the state, but it refuted the idea of collapse without a fight. It stood up to military superiority and paid a high price for it. Their defeat opened a brutal period of occupation, but their resistance became the basis of a long Polish struggle in exile, underground, and on the fronts of the rest of the World War. Poland lost the campaign, but it did not give up its claim to freedom. The army of 1939 was defeated, but it left behind a legacy of courage, tragedy, and national self-assertion. And that is precisely why it must be considered not as a backward army in a modern war, but as the armed force of a threatened state, fighting in almost impossible conditions. Chapter 11. Terror from the Air. The Polish campaign was not only a war of tanks, infantry, and rapid advances. It was also a war from the air, and it was precisely this dimension that made the attack so harrowing for many people. By 1939, military theorists, politicians, and civilians had already suspected that a new European war would look different from the First World War. Aircraft had developed enormously since 1918. They could fly farther, carry heavier bombs, reach targets faster, and strike fear into entire cities. But for the people of Poland, this was no longer a theory. On September 1, 1939, modern air warfare became a reality. It hit train stations, bridges, roads, military installations, cities, villages, and people who often did not know why their place was the target. The war came not only across the border, but from the sky. The German Luftwaffe played a central role in the attack on Poland. It was intended to eliminate the Polish Air Force as early as possible, destroy transport routes, hinder mobilization, and support the advance of the ground troops. This was not only about the direct destruction of military targets. Airstrikes were intended to create confusion, disrupt command channels, delay supplies, and weaken moral resilience. An army that cannot move its troops in time, whose railway stations have been destroyed, whose streets are full of refugees and burning vehicles, and whose leadership no longer receives reliable news, is not only losing material. She is losing her bearings. This was exactly what German warfare was aimed at. This strategy was already evident in the first hours of the campaign. German planes attacked Polish airfields in order to hit the enemy air force on the ground. They bombed traffic arteries to paralyze Polish mobilization. They supported tank formations by attacking resistance nests, artillery positions, or marching columns. This close connection between the Luftwaffe and ground operations was an important part of the German war of movement. The planes looked like an extended arm of the advancing troops. They were to strike where Polish units were gathering, retreating, or trying to establish a new line of defense. But the air war in Poland was not limited to military targets. Many attacks hit civilian areas hard. In particular, the attack on Wylan on the morning of September 1st became a symbol of German violence from the air. The city was not on a decisive front line and was still badly hit. Houses, public buildings, and the hospital were destroyed or damaged, and numerous civilians died. To this day, Wylan stands for the experience that the war did not begin where soldiers met. It also began where people suddenly became victims of military violence in their homes, in hospitals, on streets and squares. For many Poles, this was the first proof that this war would not know a clear border between the front and the homeland. The psychological impact of such attacks was enormous. Bombings do not only cause destruction. They create uncertainty, panic, and the feeling of being completely at the mercy of others. A soldier on the front line can sometimes see the enemy, dig in, shoot, dodge, or respond to orders. A civilian under bombs hardly has these possibilities. He hears engines, sirens, explosions, bursting glass and collapsing walls. He doesn't know whether the next bomb will hit his own street. He doesn't know whether escape is safer than staying. This uncertainty was part of the horror experience of modern war. Heaven, which was a familiar space in peace, became a threat. In Poland, this situation was exacerbated by the movement of large flows of refugees. As German troops advanced and cities were bombed, many people made their way east or to supposedly safer areas. Families moved with wagons, bicycles, few belongings, and children along roads that were also used by military units. This created chaos. The Luftwaffe also attacked traffic routes and columns, which often put soldiers and civilians in the same danger area. Roads were blocked, bridges destroyed, vehicles burned, animals died, people sought cover in ditches or forests. The war moved faster than many were able to flee. For the Polish army, the airstrikes were particularly serious because they further complicated the already difficult coordination. Poland had brave pilots and individual modern aircraft, but the Luftwaffe was inferior to the German in numbers, equipment, and operational possibilities. Although many Polish aircraft were not simply completely destroyed on the ground, as German propaganda later liked to claim, the Polish Air Force was unable to achieve permanent air supremacy. They had to operate in difficult conditions, change airfields, secure fuel and spare parts, and at the same time hold their own against superior air power. As a result, German bombers and dive bombers had greater freedom of action in many sections. The dive bombers were particularly feared. They struck down on their targets at a steep angle and were able to have a great effect at certain points. Their sirens intensified the terror. It was no coincidence that this sound was so effective. It hit the person directly, even before the bomb hit. It heralded destruction and created a fear that was deeply imprinted. For soldiers, such an attack could mean that a position suddenly became untenable. For civilians, it meant that war came down from heaven with an almost personal force. Many memories of September 1939 are therefore not only memories of visible destruction, but of sounds, engines, howling, detonations, screams. The air war also had a political dimension. It was supposed to hit the Polish state in its ability to act. Government, administration, railways, telephone lines, bridges, and railway stations were not simply technical facilities. They were the nerves of a state at war. If they were destroyed, the state lost the ability to react quickly and in an orderly manner. The German leadership did not only want to beat Polish soldiers. It wanted to bring down the Polish defense as a system. Air raids were a suitable means for this, because they could have an effect deep into the hinterland. They made it clear that there was no longer a safe space. In Warsaw, this experience became particularly dramatic. The capital was a political center, a symbol of Polish independence, and later an important place of resistance. Warsaw was attacked from the air during the campaign. The bombings caused severe damage and many casualties. For the inhabitants, this meant that the defense of their country was no longer abstract. They saw burning buildings, destroyed roads, injured, dead, overcrowded shelters, and exhausted helpers. Warsaw became a place where military strategy and civilian suffering were inextricably linked. The city was not only to be conquered, but also forced to surrender by pressure from the air and the ground. The German side usually justified its attacks with military necessities. Of course, there were military targets, and of course train stations, bridges, or troop concentrations were of strategic importance in a war. But the Polish campaign also showed how easily this logic spread to civilian areas. As soon as a city was considered a transport hub, administrative center, or place of resistance, its inhabitants became part of the risk. Modern warfare turned infrastructure into a target and people near that infrastructure into potential victims. This development was to take on even more devastating proportions in the further course of the Second World War. Precisely for this reason, the air war against Poland is an early glimpse of what was to come for Europe. The bombings of 1939 were not identical with the later gigantic air raids on cities in Germany, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, or Japan. But they were already pointing the way. The war would not be confined to battlefields. The civilian population would suffer not only indirectly from hunger, loss, and occupation, but directly from bombs, fire, and destruction. The sky became a front. This change shaped the entire 20th century. For Poland, terror from the air was combined with the experience of political abandonment. People knew that Britain and France had given guarantees. But the planes that appeared over Polish cities were German. The help from the West was not noticeable in these first days. While Polish soldiers fought and civilians suffered from bombs, the hoped for relief failed to materialize. This intensified the feeling of being alone. The air war was therefore not only physical destruction, but also mental shock. He showed people that treaties and promises could not protect them from the bombs at the immediate moment. At the same time, the Polish reaction must not be told only as a victim story. Despite the attacks, authorities, rescue workers, soldiers, and ordinary citizens tried to maintain order. The injured were treated, fires were extinguished, roads were cleared, children were protected, information was passed on. People helped each other in situations where state structures were already overwhelmed. It is precisely in such moments that it becomes clear that terror does not automatically mean surrender. The German Luftwaffe could destroy cities and frighten people, but it could not immediately break the will to assert itself. Many Poles experienced the bombings as proof of the brutality of the aggressor and not as a reason to recognize his rule. The terror from the air in the Polish campaign was therefore more than a military chapter. It was a foretaste of the total character of the coming war. He made it clear that modern technology does not automatically mean progress. Airplanes could connect, rescue, and overcome borders. In the hands of an aggressive regime, they became tools of intimidation and destruction. The German Luftwaffe helped to weaken the Polish state militarily, but at the same time it wrote images in people's minds that reached far beyond September 1939. In the end, the air war against Poland showed how close military efficiency and moral devastation can be. From the point of view of the German planners, bombs on train stations, cities, and roads were part of a strategy. From the point of view of the people on the ground, they were the moment when the world fell apart. The Polish campaign was therefore not only characterized by tank columns and border battles, but also by burning houses, destroyed hospitals, frightened children, fleeing families, and the constant gaze to the sky. The war began with a claim to be decided quickly. But for the victims of his airstrikes, his echo lasted a lifetime. Chapter 12: Great Britain and France declare war. When German troops invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, it was not only the fate of a single country that was at stake. At that moment, the credibility of the European security order was also tested. Great Britain and France had given Poland guarantees in the spring of 1939. These promises were not born out of mere sympathy, but out of a bitter realization: Hitler's policy could no longer be stopped by concessions. After the Anschluss of Austria, after the Munich Agreement, and after the breakup of Czechoslovakia, it had become clear that any new German demand did not mean the end, but only the next stage of expansion. Poland thus became a test case. If London and Paris also accepted this attack, any further warning to Hitler would have been worthless. Then Germany could have learned that even open violence against a guaranteed state had no consequences. Nevertheless, the decision to go to war in Great Britain and France was by no means easy. Both countries were still deeply overshadowed by the First World War. The memory of the trenches, the millions of deaths, the destroyed families, and the economic upheavals was vivid. In France, a large part of the population had been directly affected by the fighting between 1914 and 1918. Entire regions had experienced devastation. Almost every family knew loss. Great Britain had also made enormous sacrifices and wanted to avoid a new continental war as much as possible. For this reason, the politics of the 1930s were long characterized by caution, hope for reconciliation, and fear of escalation. Many politicians believed that a new world war had to be prevented at almost all costs. But it was precisely this attitude that had encouraged Hitler. The Munich Agreement of 1938 was a turning point in this context. At that time, Great Britain and France had agreed to the cession of the Sudetenland to Germany without really including Czechoslovakia on an equal footing. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London and spoke of peace for our time. Many people breathed a sigh of relief. But the relief did not last long. In March 1939, Germany occupied the rest of the Bohemian lands and made Slovakia a dependent state. In doing so, Hitler had openly shown that his policy was not limited to the unification of German-speaking areas. He had smashed a country, although he had previously declared that he had no further territorial claims in Europe. This was a shock for London and Paris. Not because they suddenly understood Hitler in a completely new way, but because his deception was now unmistakable. The guarantee for Poland was therefore also an attempt to draw a line. It was intended to signal to Hitler that further aggression would no longer remain without war. But guarantees are easier to give than to keep. When Germany attacked Poland on September 1st, Britain and France had to decide whether they would actually act. In London and Paris, some still hoped that a final ultimatum could force Germany to retreat. They did not want to rush into a war that would devastate Europe again. At the same time, it was clear that a mere protest could not be enough. The German Wehrmacht was already on Polish soil, German planes were bombing targets in the country, and Hitler presented the attack in a lying speech as an alleged defense. The political situation left little room for illusions. On September 3, 1939, Great Britain and France declared war on the German Reich. Thus, the German attack on Poland became a European war, which would later expand into World War. For many people in Great Britain and France, this moment was marked by heaviness and grief. There was no jubilation like in August 1914, no broad enthusiasm for a great national adventure. Instead, there was a feeling of being drawn into a gloomy necessity. Speaking to the British people on the radio, Chamberlain declared that his efforts for peace had failed. In France, they knew that a war against Germany would threaten their own border again. The declarations of war were therefore not an expression of recklessness, but an admission that the previous policy had come to an end. For Poland, the declaration of war was initially an important political signal. It showed that Germany could not act completely without consequences, and that Poland had not simply been given up diplomatically. But militarily, the situation hardly changed in the first few days. The Polish army continued to fight largely alone. Great Britain was unable to bring large land forces to Poland at short notice. France had a strong army and was located directly on Germany's western border, but acted cautiously. Although there were limited French advances in the Saar region, a determined attack that would have forced the Wehrmacht to withdraw large forces from Poland failed to materialize. This was bitter for the Poles. They had hoped that a German attack in the west would relieve the pressure on their front. Instead, the main German force remained concentrated in the east. This phase was later often referred to as the Sitzkrieg or Drôle de guerre, i.e. a strange war. Great Britain and France were officially at war with Germany, but on the Western Front it remained comparatively quiet at first. There were several reasons for this reluctance. France's military thinking was strongly influenced by the experiences of the First World War. They relied on defense, on the Maginot Line, and on a cautious mobilization. Offensive operations against Germany were considered risky, especially as long as Britain had not yet built up its forces on a large scale on the continent. In addition, some Western planners overestimated the strength of German defenses in the West or underestimated how crucial a quick relief for Poland would have been. Strategic caution turned into de facto inaction. For Hitler, this restraint was a confirmation of his assessment, at least in the short term. He had expected that Britain and France would be able to react, but not quickly enough to prevent the campaign against Poland. That is exactly what happened. The declarations of war were politically serious, but the Wehrmacht was able to continue its attack in the east. Poland had to pass the decisive phase alone. This revealed a tragic gap between diplomatic obligation and military reality. On paper, Poland had powerful allies. On the battlefield, however, Polish soldiers faced a superior German force, while help from the West came too late and too weak. Nevertheless, the declarations of war should not be regarded as meaningless. They fundamentally changed the character of the conflict. Hitler had hoped to isolate Poland and perhaps make the West give in again. With September 3rd, it was clear that the attack would not be localized. The German Reich was now at war with the most important Western democracies in Europe. Even though little happened on the Western Front at first, Germany's strategic position had become more dangerous in the long term. A war against Britain meant the prospect of blockade, economic pressure, and a conflict that could not be ended simply by a quick victory in Poland. A war against France meant that Germany would sooner or later have to act in the West. The Second World War had thus acquired a dynamic that Hitler had taken into account but had not fully controlled. The step was also significant for Europe's political morale. Britain and France had hesitated for a long time, but now they were no longer just saying that Hitler's aggression was dangerous. They declared war on him. This was a break with the previous policy of giving in. However, this rupture was incomplete because it was not immediately associated with decisive military action. This is precisely where the ambivalence of these days lies. The Western powers showed political determination, but military caution. They fulfilled their obligation formally and diplomatically, but could not save Poland. For Poland, the result was devastating, even if the declarations of war later became important for the continued existence of the Polish cause in exile. Despite the difficult situation, the Polish government and many Polish soldiers had high hopes for the West. It was believed that the German Wehrmacht could not remain in the East indefinitely if France seriously attacked in the West. But this hope was not fulfilled. While German tanks continued to advance, while Warsaw was bombed, and while Polish units tried to regroup, the major Western offensive failed to materialize. This experience had a profound impact on Polish historical memory. Many Poles perceived the attitude of the Allies as a betrayal or at least a tragic failure. From a Western point of view, the caution may be strategically explainable. From the Polish point of view, it meant that, despite alliances, they were heading for their downfall alone. At the same time, the situation of Western democracies must be understood in its own logic. They were not prepared for an immediate offensive war, their societies were war-weary, their military planning cautious, and their political leaders had long hoped that a major war could be avoided. These weaknesses were real, but they did not change the fact that Hitler derived his chances precisely from these weaknesses. The dictatorship was able to make decisions more quickly, act more riskily, and prepare its population for war through propaganda. Democracies had to weigh up, convince, mobilize, and often deal with internal conflicts. That didn't make them morally weaker, but it made them slower in the crisis. Hitler had taken advantage of this slowness. The declarations of war of September 3rd therefore mark a moment full of contradictions. They were necessary because further concession would only have confirmed Hitler's power politics. They were historically powerful because they marked the beginning of the European war against Nazi Germany. At the same time, however, they were directly insufficient for Poland, because they did not stop the German advance. This tension is the tragedy of 1939. Poland had allies, but it was not exonerated in time. The Western powers recognized the danger, but their military response was too slow. Hitler got his quick war in the East, although he could not prevent the larger war in the West. For the people of London and Paris, a period of uncertainty now began. Blackouts, air raid protection measures, mobilization, conscription, and war economy changed everyday life. Many expected German airstrikes. Some expected a major offensive soon. But at first the front remained calm. This calm was deceptive. While waiting was going on in the West, People were dying in Poland, cities were destroyed, armies were smashed, and the basis for a brutal occupation was laid. The war had begun, but it showed different faces in different places. In the West, tension and waiting; in the East, fire, flight, and collapse. In the end, the declarations of war made it clear that the Polish campaign was not only a German-Polish conflict. It was the moment when the European order finally collapsed. Britain and France could no longer treat Hitler as a negotiating partner whose demands could be limited. They had to realize that his policies were based on violence, deception, and expansion. But this realization came too late for Poland to turn the campaign around. World history entered a new phase. Guarantees turned into declarations of war, diplomatic warnings turned into a global conflict, and Poland's fate became the prelude to a catastrophe that would soon engulf almost all of Europe. Chapter 13: The Soviet Invasion. When Poland was already under the massive pressure of the German attack in September 1939, the blow came that finally destroyed any hope of a longer defense. On September 17th, the Red Army crossed the eastern border of Poland. For the Polish leadership, the army, and the population, this moment meant a catastrophe of historic significance. Germany had been attacking from the west, north, and south since September 1st. The Wehrmacht had already made deep advances, bombed cities, separated Polish units, and dramatically deteriorated the military situation. But as long as the east remained open, there were theoretically still possibilities: retreat, reorganization, evasion to the southeast, perhaps a longer resistance combined with the hope of Western help. With the Soviet invasion, this last strategic possibility also collapsed. Poland was now attacked by two great powers, the very two neighbors whose common understanding the country had always feared most. The Soviet Union did not present its invasion as an attack. The official reason was that the Polish state had collapsed, so the Red Army had to protect the Ukrainian and Belarusian populations in eastern Poland. This portrayal was a political deception. Poland continued to fight, the government still existed, and the state had not given up its sovereignty. The Soviet invasion was not a humanitarian act of protection, but the implementation of a secret power political agreement with the German Reich. In the secret additional protocol of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Berlin and Moscow had defined their spheres of interest in Eastern Europe. Poland had effectively become a partition in it. What had been decided in diplomatic rooms on August 23 became reality on September 17 with tanks, infantry, and force. For Stalin, the timing was carefully chosen. It is no coincidence that the Soviet Union waited more than 2 weeks after the German attack. Moscow observed how quickly the Wehrmacht was advancing, how strong the Polish defense still was, and how Great Britain and France reacted. It was only when it became clear that Poland was badly battered militarily, and that the Western powers would not bring immediate relief, that Stalin set his own troops in motion. That was typical of his policy in this situation. He wanted to profit, but limit the risk. The Soviet Union was not to enter into an uncertain war against a Poland that was still fully capable of acting, but to intervene in a moment when the enemy was already weakened by Germany. Thus, Stalin was able to win territories without bearing the brunt of the struggle. For the Polish army, the news of the Soviet invasion was devastating. Many units were already fighting against the Wehrmacht. Others tried to retreat to the east or southeast to form new lines of defense or to keep the crossing to Romania and Hungary open. These plans have now been destroyed. The room that was supposed to serve as a retreat suddenly became a war zone itself. Polish commanders were faced with an almost insoluble question. Should they fight against the Soviets, even though the main forces were already tied up against Germany? Should they evade, surrender, or try to escape abroad? The Polish leadership finally gave the order to avoid major fighting with the Red Army if possible, unless there were attacks, and to withdraw in the direction of Romania and Hungary. This decision did not arise from trust in Moscow, but from military reality. A war on two fronts against Germany and the Soviet Union could no longer be won. Nevertheless, fighting broke out between Polish units and Soviet troops in various places. Especially where Polish soldiers were attacked or defended strategic points, they resisted. Some garrisons and units did not want to surrender without a fight. others had no clear orders or could not follow the situation in time. Communication was chaotic, the fronts dissolved, streams of refugees moved across the streets, and messages contradicted each other. In this confusion, it was often not immediately clear whether Soviet troops were acting as an enemy, as an alleged neutral power, or as a new occupying power. But at the latest, with the advance and disarmament of Polish units, it became clear that the Red Army had not come to help Poland. The Soviet invasion also had a deep psychological effect. Many Poles had experienced Germany as their immediate main enemy, but the Soviet Union was also associated with fear and mistrust. The memory of the War of 1920, the advance of the Red Army and communist ideology was still alive. Now the nightmare of a new division of Poland seemed to be repeated. The country, which had become independent again in 1918 after more than 100 years of foreign rule, was once again smashed by its neighbors. For many people, this moment was not only a military defeat, but a historical trauma. The past of divisions returned in a modern, brutal form. In the eastern regions of Poland, the situation was particularly complex. In addition to Poles, many Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, and other groups also lived there. Soviet propaganda tried to portray the invasion as the liberation of the non-Polish population from Polish rule. In fact, there were social and national tensions in these regions, and not everyone felt the Polish state as their own in the same way. But the Soviet occupation did not bring real freedom. It brought political control, arrests, expropriations, deportations, and the incorporation of the territories into the Soviet system of rule. Those who initially hoped that the new power would bring social justice or national rights soon realized that Stalin demanded obedience above all else. Soviet policy was not aimed at self-determination, but at submission. For Polish officers, civil servants, police officers, intellectuals, and representatives of the state, a particularly dangerous time began. They saw the Soviet Union as potential adversaries, as bearers of Polish statehood, and as a risk to the new order. Many were arrested, taken to camps, or later murdered. The most famous expression of this policy was the Katyn massacre in 1940, in which thousands of Polish officers and members of the elite were killed by Soviet intelligence. Even though this crime happened after the campaign, it was rooted in the logic of the Soviet invasion. The Polish ruling class was to be eliminated so that resistance would be more difficult and the Polish state could not be re-established. Thus, German and Soviet occupation policies were similar in one crucial respect, even if their ideologies were different. Both wanted to destroy Poland as an independent political force. The encounter between German and Soviet troops on Polish territory made the division visible. In some places, there were votes on demarcation lines, handovers, and even joint public gestures. For the Polish population, the image of German and Soviet soldiers meeting on the soil of a shattered country was a sign of extreme humiliation. Two dictatorships, which publicly presented themselves as enemies of each other's worldviews, practically worked together as long as it served their interests. The war against Poland thus exposed the cold logic of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Ideological enmity could pause if common booty beckoned. For the Polish government, the situation became untenable. In order not to fall into German or Soviet captivity and to preserve the continuity of the state, she left Poland and went into exile via Romania. This step was misunderstood by some contemporaries or interpreted as an escape, but it had an important political significance. As long as a legitimate Polish government existed abroad, Poland could continue to be represented diplomatically. The state was militarily defeated and territorially occupied, but it did not completely disappear from international politics. Later, a Polish government in exile was formed, and Polish forces continued to fight on various fronts, in France, in Great Britain, in North Africa, in Italy, and on the side of the Allies. The Soviet invasion thus destroyed the campaign, but not Poland's claim to independence. For the German side, the Soviet attack was a decisive advantage. The Wehrmacht was able to conclude the war against Poland more quickly because Poland no longer had a safe retreat. The Polish army was crushed between two enemies, and the political leadership lost the opportunity to continue a stable defense at home. Hitler had wanted to achieve exactly this with the pact, a free hand in Western Poland and the certainty that Stalin would not act against Germany in the East. Stalin, in turn, gained territory, influence, and time. Both dictators believed that they had achieved their goals. For Poland, this agreement meant collapse. September 17, 1939 is therefore one of the most bitter days in Polish history of the 20th century. He showed that Poland was not only a victim of German aggression, but also a victim of Soviet power politics. From that moment on, the campaign was no longer just the story of a German attack, but the story of a double defeat. The Polish soldiers who continued to fight did so in a situation that left little hope strategically. The civilian population faced not one, but two occupying powers. Families were separated, people fled, officials burned documents, officers tried to get their men to safety, and everywhere the certainty spread that an entire state order was collapsing. In the end, the Soviet invasion made it clear how brutal the power politics of 1939 was. Treaties did not serve peace, but the preparation of violence. Ideological differences did not prevent cooperation if both sides could benefit. Small and medium-sized states were not treated as equal actors, but as spaces that great powers divided among themselves. Poland paid the price. The invasion of the Red Army sealed the military defeat and at the same time opened up a second occupation experience that meant suffering, deportation, persecution, and death for millions of people. The Polish campaign was therefore not simply a quick German victory. It was the result of a pincer movement from the West and the East, prepared by diplomacy, obscured by propaganda, and completed by military force. September 17th destroyed the last illusion that Poland could save itself by retreating and holding out until the Western powers intervened effectively. From now on, it was no longer about victory in the campaign, but about the survival of a people, a political idea, and a memory of independence. Poland was divided, but it was not wiped out. This was precisely the tragedy, and at the same time the later power of Polish history. Chapter 14: Occupation, Violence, and Partition of Poland. After Poland's military defeat, an ordinary period of occupation did not simply begin, as Europe knew it from previous wars. What befell Poland in the autumn of 1939 was a double foreign rule, supported by two dictatorships that not only wanted to control the Polish state, but to destroy it. Germany and the Soviet Union had militarily crushed Poland and now divided the country according to their own interests. For the people, this meant the loss of state order, the collapse of familiar securities, and the beginning of an everyday life in which violence, fear, and arbitrariness became constant companions. For Poland, the war did not end with the defeat of the army. On the contrary, for many, the longest and cruelest phase has only just begun. The German Reich incorporated parts of Western Poland directly into its territory. These included territories that were considered regained from the German point of view or were particularly important for future Germanization. Other parts were organized as the so-called general government under German administration. This area was not a normal occupied state with limited self-government, but a space to be exploited, controlled, and brutally dominated. The Nazi leadership did not see Poland as equal people with political rights, but as a population to be subjugated, displaced, or used as labor. This view shaped almost every measure of the occupation. From the very beginning, German violence was directed in particular against those people who were considered bearers of Polish identity and state continuity. Teachers, priests, civil servants, officers, professors, doctors, lawyers, journalists, writers, and local leaders were targeted. The occupiers knew very well that a nation consists not only of borders and government, but also of people who can pass on knowledge, preserve culture, organize administration, and mentally prepare resistance. Therefore, German policy aimed to break the Polish elite. Arrests, shootings, deportations, and intimidation were intended to prevent an orderly national countermovement from forming. This violence was not accidental and not just the result of individual excesses. It was prepared and ideologically wanted. Even before and during the campaign, German authorities had drawn up lists of people who were to be arrested or killed. After the invasion, murders followed, in which thousands of members of the Polish ruling class were murdered. Shootings took place in cities, villages, and forests. People disappeared from their homes, were taken out of schools and universities, arrested from churches, offices, or on the street. The message was clear: anyone who embodied Polish self-assertion was living dangerously. The situation of the Jewish population in Poland was particularly cruel. Before the war, Poland was one of the most important centers of Jewish life in Europe. Millions of Jews lived there, in large cities such as Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, and Lublin, as well as in small towns whose religious, economic, and cultural life had been Jewish for centuries. With the German occupation, an increasingly radical persecution began for them. First came deprivation of rights, humiliation, identification, expropriation, forced labor, and violence. Jewish businesses were looted or taken over, synagogues were desecrated, people were mistreated, humiliated on the streets, or arbitrarily shot. Later, ghettos were created in which Jewish people were crammed together under catastrophic conditions. The Polish campaign was thus also the prelude to the development that ultimately led to the Holocaust. But the non-Jewish Polish population was also exposed to massive violence. Entire families were expelled from their homes, especially in the incorporated western areas, where space was to be made for German settlers. Property was confiscated, farms were taken over, apartments were evacuated, schools closed or redesigned according to German specifications. The Polish language was displaced from many public areas. Education was to be restricted, because the occupiers did not want a self-confident Polish society, but a population that did simple work and remained politically powerless. Behind these measures was a clear logic of domination. Anyone who takes knowledge, property, leadership, and language from a people is trying to control its future. In Soviet-occupied Eastern Poland, violence took a different form, but was also profound. The Soviet Union incorporated the conquered territories into the Ukrainian and Belarusian Soviet republics and presented this as an alleged liberation of the Ukrainians and Belarusians living there. In fact, it meant the introduction of Soviet rule with secret police, political control, expropriations, and deportations. Polish officials, officers, landowners, police officers, teachers, and other persons classified as politically dangerous were persecuted. Many people were arrested and taken to camps. Others were deported with their families in cattle cars to distant regions of the Soviet Union, to Siberia, Kazakhstan, or other inhospitable areas. The deportations tore people from their lives, separated families, and led to countless deaths due to hunger, cold, disease, and forced labor. The Soviet occupation worked less with the racist language of the National Socialists, but it also pursued the goal of permanently destroying Polish statehood. Communist ideology spoke of class enemies, enemies of the people, and the liberation of oppressed groups. But behind these terms stood a power apparatus that did not tolerate any independent Polish political will. Anyone who was considered a representative of the old state, who owned property, who did not fit into the new order religiously, nationally, or politically, could become a target. Schools, administrations, and institutions were redesigned, Soviet symbols and structures were introduced, and the population had to learn that a different dictatorship now ruled their lives. Particularly tragic was the fate of many Polish officers and civil servants who had been taken prisoner by the Soviets. They were not treated as ordinary prisoners of war, but as potential enemies of a future Soviet order in Poland. In 1940, the Soviet leadership had thousands of them murdered. The Katyn massacre became one of the best-known symbols of Soviet violence against Poland. It shows that Moscow, too, not only wanted to secure territories, but also deliberately eliminated those people who could have been important for an independent Polish future. The murder of officers, police officers, civil servants, and intellectuals was an attack on the memory and leadership of an entire nation. The division of Poland often meant complete disorientation for families. Borders that had not existed before suddenly cut through regions, transport routes, and biographies. Anyone living in the German-occupied territory had to fear different regulations, different dangers, and other forms of violence than someone living in Soviet territory. But everywhere the message was the same: the Polish state was to disappear. People had to apply for new papers, register, follow orders, avoid occupying soldiers, organize food, and constantly expect that a false remark, denunciation, or suspicion could have the most serious consequences. Everyday life became political. Even speaking one's own language, listening to forbidden news, or preserving national symbols could become dangerous. At the same time, resistance began to form early on. The defeat of 1939 did not mean that Poland capitulated internally. Networks, secret schools, intelligence structures, military organizations, and aid groups emerged underground. The Polish government in exile tried to preserve the continuity of the state abroad, while in the occupied country people collected information at high risk, supported the persecuted, prepared sabotage, or continued cultural life in secret. This resistance was dangerous, because both occupying powers reacted brutally to any form of disobedience. Nevertheless, he showed that the destruction of the state did not automatically mean the destruction of national identity. The occupation also created moral tensions within society. In a world of fear, people had to make decisions on a daily basis. Some helped persecuted people and risked their own lives. Others were just trying to survive and kept away from any danger. Still others worked with the occupiers out of conviction, opportunism, or fear. Occupation is never just a state of military control. It intervenes in relationships, neighborhoods, families, and consciences. It confronts people with questions to which there are often no easy answers. Anyone who needed bread for their children, who was threatened, who wanted to save a relative, or who was persecuted themselves had to act in a reality shaped by violence. For Germany and the Soviet Union, the partition of Poland was a short-term success. Both received territories, influence, and strategic advantages. But for Poland, it meant a national catastrophe. The country was erased from the map as an independent state, its population divided between two dictatorships, its elites persecuted, its minorities instrumentalized, and its future violently obscured. The occupation was not only a consequence of the war, but a target of the war. Hitler had not attacked Poland to solve a small border question. Stalin had not invaded to protect people. Both used the war to gain power over space and people. At the end, Chapter 14 shows the actual depth of the Polish campaign. The military defeat was only the beginning. Then came the political annihilation, the social destruction, and the moral devastation of an entire country. Poland was divided, but not internally wiped out. It was precisely under the violence of the occupation that a will to resist arose that was to characterize the following years. People lost their state, but many clung to the idea that Poland continued to exist, in memory, in exile, underground, in language, in faith, and in daily survival. The occupation wanted to break Poland. But she also created a story of suffering, courage, and perseverance that reaches far beyond September 1939. Chapter 15: Why the Polish Campaign Changed the World. The Polish campaign was much more than a military attack on a single state. It was the moment when the violent policy of National Socialist Germany finally turned into a European war. By September 1939, Hitler had destroyed the Versailles Order step by step, moved borders, broken treaties, and repeatedly presented his opponents with a fait accompli. But with the invasion of Poland, this development reached a new level. Now it was no longer a matter of threats, diplomatic blackmail, or the annexation of individual territories. Now a modern army marched into a sovereign country, bombed cities, smashed state structures, and opened an occupation policy that was oriented toward submission and violence from the beginning. September 1st, 1939 therefore became a date on which the history of Europe changed irrevocably. For Poland, the campaign initially meant a national catastrophe. A state that had only been independent again since 1918 was militarily defeated within a few weeks and divided between two dictatorships. Germany attacked from the west, north, and south, and the Soviet Union invaded from the east on September 17th. This fulfilled the worst nightmare of Polish security policy. Poland not only faced a superior opponent, but was crushed between two great powers that did not respect its independence. The defeat was therefore not simply the result of a lost campaign. It was the violent extinction of state sovereignty through a power political agreement that had decided the fate of millions of people. But the significance of the Polish campaign extends far beyond Poland. The attack made it clear that Hitler could no longer be stopped by concessions. The policy of appeasement pursued by Britain and France in the years before had finally failed. In the case of the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, Hitler had learned that decisive risk was often rewarded. The West had hesitated, negotiated, hoped, and gave in. Poland now became the limit of this policy. When Germany attacked in spite of all warnings, Britain and France had to act if their guarantees were to have any value. The declarations of war of September 3, 1939, turned the invasion of Poland into a European war. A regional aggression turned into the beginning of a conflict that would soon engulf almost the entire world. The Polish campaign also changed the understanding of modern warfare. The Wehrmacht relied on speed, surprise, air support, tank formations, and coordinated movements. The war was not waged as a slow advance, but as an attempt to confuse, cut up, and politically incapacitate the enemy in a short time. Roads, train stations, bridges, airfields, and communication centers became decisive targets. This revealed a new form of war in which not only the front counts, but the entire system of a state. An army could be defeated by hitting its movement, its orders, its provisions, and its morale at the same time. Poland became the first major theater of this kind of war of movement, which would later also play a central role in Western Europe. At the same time, the campaign showed how dangerous it is to separate military modernity from moral responsibility. Tanks, aircraft, radio, and fast command seemed modern from a technical point of view, but they served a criminal goal. The German attack was not a neutral military test, but a war of aggression. Modern operations opened the way for occupation, persecution, and terror. Behind the fighting troops followed units, authorities, and organizations that were supposed to arrest political opponents, eliminate Polish elites, and disenfranchise the Jewish population. In this way, military efficiency was combined with ideological brutality. This was one of the frightening lessons of the Polish campaign. Progress in technology and organization does not automatically mean progress in humanity. It can only make destruction faster and more comprehensive. The campaign was also an early example of how propaganda and war intertwine. Hitler did not want the attack to appear for what it was. Therefore, pretexts were staged, border incidents were invented, and Poland was portrayed as an alleged aggressor. The attack on the Gliwice transmitter became a symbol of this lie. The National Socialist leadership knew that a war is not only fought with weapons, but also with narratives. Those who can shift blame, those who sell their own attack as a defense, those who dehumanize the opponent, prepare violence not only practically, but also mentally. The Polish campaign therefore shows how important language is in political crises. Words can deceive, soothe, incite, and finally open the way for bombs and tanks. The role of the Soviet Union also fundamentally changed the image of Europe. The Hitler-Stalin Pact had shown that two ideologically hostile dictatorships were willing to work together if it served their power interests. The Soviet invasion of eastern Poland proved that Stalin was not only a spectator of the German attack, but also profited from the destruction of Poland. Thus, Eastern Europe became the space of cynical great power politics, in which smaller states were treated not as sovereign actors, but as territories that could be divided, moved, and controlled. For the people who lived there, this meant not abstract diplomacy, but arrest, deportation, expropriation, occupation, and death. For the Polish population, an occupation period of extraordinary hardship began after the campaign. The German terror was directed against Jews, Polish elites, clergy, teachers, civil servants, resistance fighters, and countless civilians. Soviet rule in the East brought arrests, deportations, and the elimination of state and social ruling classes. Poland became a country where two dictatorships consolidated their power through fear and violence. But despite this oppression, Poland did not disappear. The government went into exile. Soldiers later continued to fight on many fronts, and one of the most important underground states in Europe emerged in the occupied country. It is precisely this continuation of the struggle that shows that military defeat was not synonymous with a national end. In the long term, the Polish campaign also changed the moral understanding of the Second World War. He made it clear early on that this war was not just a conflict between states. It was a war against political order, against self-determination, and against entire population groups. In Poland, the patterns became recognizable that were later to appear even more cruel and comprehensive: occupation as rule by terror, air raids against cities, persecution of elites, deprivation of rights of the Jewish population, forced labor, deportation, and ideological dehumanization. Anyone who wants to understand the further course of the Second World War must therefore look to Poland. Many of his horrors began there not as an exception, but as part of an already established logic of violence. The Polish campaign finally also changed the political map of thought. He showed that security cannot be based on treaties alone if powerful states are willing to deliberately break these treaties. He showed that guarantees without the ability to act quickly can be tragically inadequate. He showed that dictatorships can use peace language while preparing for war. And he showed that the defense of a small or medium-sized state sometimes becomes the touchstone of an entire international order. In 1939, Poland was not only a country on the edge of Europe. It became the place where it was decided whether violent politics could still be limited. The answer came too late and was initially too weak, but it eventually led to the long struggle against Nazi Germany. In the end, the Polish campaign remains an event full of tragedy, warning, and historical significance. It began with lies, was waged with modern military force, and ended in occupation, division, and immeasurable suffering. But it also showed the will to resist of a country that did not disappear despite defeat. Poland lost its freedom in 1939, but not its claim to the future. The attack on Poland was the beginning of a world war, but it was also the beginning of a long history of resistance, remembrance, and return. Therefore, the Polish campaign changed the world not only because it triggered the Second World War. He changed it because he showed where power without law, ideology without humanity, and diplomacy without honesty can lead.